Hello. Welcome to the channel if you're new, and welcome back if you're a regular. Tell me where you're from and what time you're listening. Now get comfy and let's begin. I lived in the same house from the time I was born until I turned 10. It was a pretty standard suburban home, nothing special. It wasn't particularly old, and it was outfitted with cheap materials. Everything you'd expect in mass-produced homes meant to cut costs. It was just a generic little box, one among many in a neighborhood full of identical homes. The house had a finished basement, filled with toys, which should have made it a child's dream. There were 2 rooms down there. The main room was the first one you'd enter when you went down the stairs. It had a TV, a computer, and a pull-out couch perfect for sleepovers. The other room was smaller, what we called the back room. The back room was full of bins filled with toys. It was pretty much a playroom for me and my siblings. There was a whiteboard on one wall, while the other walls were almost entirely taken up by sliding doors leading to small storage and utility rooms. I spent a lot of time down there, often alone, while my mom took care of things upstairs. I'd spend hours in the back room, playing with dolls or whatever little girls play with, until a feeling of unease would settle in, and I'd retreat back upstairs to my mom for comfort. This would happen nearly every time I played down there. I'd play until I got scared, then run upstairs. I didn't think much about the uneasy feeling at the time because it had been a constant presence in that room my entire life, and when you're 4 years old, you don't really dwell on those things. Looking back, I now understand why I felt that fear. It was as if I was being watched. The feeling was strongest when I was alone in the back room, but I could still feel it even when I was in the main room or around other people. A good example of this was during sleepovers when I was about 7 years old. I always chose to sleep in the main room because it had the pull-out couch and a TV. The couch was positioned as far from the back room's doorway as possible, but still with a clear view of it. I always picked the spot farthest from the doorway, trying to distance myself from the uneasy feeling that room caused, especially at night. Late at night, I'd feel like someone was watching me. I'd glance at the doorway, expecting to see a woman standing there. Even though I never actually saw her with my eyes, I could picture her clearly in my mind, as if I saw her with my mind instead. Even now, I have a vivid image of her. She was tall, thin, and gaunt, an older woman, probably in her 60s or 70s, with messy, frizzy gray hair that reached her shoulders. Her cheekbones were sharply pronounced, as if she hadn't eaten in months, or like her flesh was starting to decay off her bones. The thing that stood out to me the most was her eyes. They were dark and sunken, vacant with a 1,000-yard stare. I did not know it at the time, but after working at an assisted living facility and seeing dying people, I realized that she looked like she was dying or perhaps already dead. She frightened me, but not as much as the other presence. The thought of the other presence still sends ice-cold terror through my veins. Nearly 10 years later, I never saw him, not even mentally, but I felt the darkness he emitted. I think I could never picture what he looked like because he did not look like anything, like he was inhuman and could shift into any form he pleased. He felt dark and powerful, like pure evil. I felt his presence strongest in the back room, especially when I felt like I was being watched. The dark, malicious energy was suffocating. There, I took special care to not look too closely at the slats of the doors that led to the storage rooms, because I was afraid I would see his dark, faceless eyes staring back at me. I learned to not look too closely at the darkness. There were times when I avoided that room entirely, like late at night when everything felt amplified. There were also month-long periods where I could not go into that room alone. I don't exactly know why there were periods when I felt like I could and couldn't be there. Maybe I had exhausted my courage and needed time to build it back up again. Maybe there were certain periods where the presences were just stronger. These periods would frustrate my parents to no end because they dismissed my fears as childish nonsense. They had never spent a night in that basement the way I had with my sleepovers. They have never felt the gaunt woman's eyes on them as they slept. They had never felt the dark, malevolent energy that radiated from the back of the room in the middle of the night. Eventually, after moving out of that house, I began to think it was just childish nonsense too. I never actually saw anything unusual, so it was probably just my overactive childhood imagination. right? Well, that was what I thought until I brought it up to my sister years after moving out of there. My sister is 6 years older than me, so she was 16 when we moved out of that house. She was old enough to be over that sort of childishness. I had mentioned it to her to joke about how dumb I was as a kid, and how my imagination must have gone into overdrive. I stopped in my tracks when she told me deadly serious. No, that house was haunted. It wasn't just you. She and my brother, who was 14 when we moved, were fully convinced the place was haunted without me saying anything about the basement. She said that her and my brother thought the basement in particular was haunted. I took things a little more seriously after that conversation, but I wasn't entirely convinced. We were siblings after all, and had talked to each other about the uneasiness in the basement when we lived there. We likely colored each other's perceptions and freaked each other out. At least that's what I thought until I brought this up to a childhood friend. This friend and I were pretty close in elementary school, but fell out of touch in middle and high school. We now go to the same college and have gotten more in touch because of it. One day, when I was with her, I realized that she had been in the basement countless times while we played and had sleepovers. She should also be relatively unbiased because I never told her about the haunting at the time, because I didn't want to scare my friends off. I mentioned my conversation with my sister to her, and she was unsurprised. She told me that she had thought the house and the basement in particular was haunted. She hadn't told me at the time because she didn't want to freak me out. She went on to say that the back room was where it was the worst. I did not tell her that my siblings and I thought that the basement was the most haunted part of the house, much less anything about the back room. Needless to say, I took things more seriously after that. What really freaks me out is my nightmares. To this day, whenever I have paranormal nightmares, it is always in that basement or the hallway leading up to the basement door. I have had dreams where I went down the stairs at my current house, only for it to shift to the bottom of the stairs at my old house. When I walked down the hallway by the stairs and past the basement door, there was the woman floating ominously. In another nightmare that I had, I turned into a grotesque and mangled monster, and I was inexplicably drawn down that hallway towards the basement. It was like I knew that was where monsters belonged. These nightmares freak me out because dreams are often used by your brain to sort through information and trauma. When I had these dreams, I had just about forgotten about that basement, and I've only recently pieced all of this together. It is entirely possible that I had an experience that scared me to the point of trauma in that basement, but I can't remember it because it is blocked from my memory. In that case, my brain may still be trying to work through it through my dreams. If that is true, I hope that memory never comes to the surface because some things are best left unknown. I never want to experience anything similar to that basement ever again because sometimes childhood fears are more than just childish nonsense. I'll start with a little about myself. I'm 19 years old and live in the UK. Until recently, I was a complete skeptic when it came to anything supernatural. Ghosts, demons, those stories never really bothered me because I could always convince myself that there was a logical explanation. But lately, I've had a series of strange experiences that have completely shifted how I think. Not about ghosts or anything like that, but about aliens. I've always had a deep-seated fear of gray aliens. Not a phobia like people have with spiders, where they can't even look at or hear about their feared creatures. In fact, I've always been fascinated by the idea of aliens, and I really want to believe that they exist and that we're not alone in the universe. But something about the thought of gray aliens fills me with a sense of dread and despair that I can't shake. If I think about them too much, I can't sleep. I get anxious just knowing there's a corner outside I can't see around, and I need some sort of noise to help me drift off, or my mind starts running wild. About 3 months ago, I had my first ever night terror. My dad has had them for years, and his were usually pretty funny. Like when he woke up screaming because he thought my nan's eyes were glowing neon. But mine was nothing like that. I was lying in bed with my girlfriend, trying to fall asleep. I remember every part of the dream like it was real. I was in the same clothes, same position, with the curtains just the way they were. The curtains were slightly open, so I did struggle to sleep, but I didn't want to seem like an idiot in front of her. I mean, who can't sleep because they're scared of the tiniest sliver of the outside world? I tried not to let it bother me. The only thing that happened in the dream was that I saw a face right in the center of the gap in the window. It didn't move, didn't blink. It just floated there, staring at me. But whatever it wasn't human. Its face was long, almost like a slice of pizza, rounded at the top and tapering down to a point at the bottom. I'm not sure if it was blocked by the curtains, but this was all I could make out, and to be honest, it was all I wanted to see. Its eyes were huge, way too big, and black, like the darkest night. No pupils, no movement, just this unblinking gaze. And I could feel it was looking at me. The sense of dread hit me, the same kind of feeling I get when I think about those gray aliens. My heart sank, and I was frozen in fear, unable to move, terrified of what might be lurking just out of sight. I've been struggling with hyperventilating ever since that night, the same kind of breathing issues I had at the end of my dream. My girlfriend woke me up, clearly worried about what was going on, but I just brushed it off as a nightmare. However, ever since that night, strange things have been happening around the house. My family had mentioned strange occurrences before, but I always dismissed them, thinking there had to be a logical explanation, like wind or lack of balance or some other simple reason. My mother, for example, said she saw a man looking at her through the doorway of the living room, but when she looked directly at the spot, he disappeared. Both her and my brother's girlfriend also experienced the same dream one night, where they were talking to twin girls by their respective bedsides. My brother and sister have claimed to see shadows darting past doorways, and my father swears he saw the curtains move on their own, despite there being no open windows. I never truly believed these stories until my own experiences began. Since that night terror, things have only gotten weirder, and honestly, it's terrified me. Objects have flown off surfaces that were impossible for them to fall from. Books, some of them weighing over a kilogram, have dropped to the floor even though they were positioned properly with no part hanging over the edge. There are loud bangs at night that sound like gunshots coming from downstairs, scaring our animals. But when we investigate, there's nothing moved. Living in the UK, it's hard to get firearms, and as far as I know, no one around here even owns a rifle, let alone shoots one indoors. Our cat has also been staring at things that aren't there, following them with eyes that dilate to the maximum, yet there's nothing visible. We've also heard knocking on our back door, which is entirely made of glass, so we should be able to see if anyone is out there. The weirdest part? Our technology constantly glitches. Lights flicker all the time, light bulbs burn out quickly, and our Wi-Fi never works properly, even after constant upgrades and extenders. It feels like something is interfering with electrical signals, especially in my room. I plugged my Xbox directly into the router on the floor above, but one night the cable was pulled out from under my door, even though it was tightly wrapped and there was no way to pull it from anywhere other than right outside my room. The strangest incident, though, happened after we heard the knocking on the back door. I lazily went up to my room to play video games, and when I got to the top of the stairs, I noticed the landing light was out again. No lights were on upstairs, and my door was shut. Suddenly, there was a bright blue flash, like someone had shown an incredibly powerful torch from inside my room, even though the door was closed. It was as if the entire floor lit up for a second. I can't explain these things, but each event keeps pulling me back to that one-night terror, to that face that terrified me. Even as I write this, I can feel the dread creeping back in. I can't stay calm, and I feel like something is always watching me, lurking just around every corner. I just want to understand what's going on. If it's psychological, then what can I do to fix it? I don't know if it's aliens like I suspect, but the dread I feel, the events, and my past fear of aliens all feel connected, and I just want to know how to make it stop. I'm 32 and live alone in a rural house. My nearest neighbors are about half a mile down the road, and we chat every now and then, but for the most part, I keep to myself. I only head into town when I really need to. I'm semi-retired, so I spend a lot of time at home, but a few months each year, I take on some contracting work. It was late fall at the time, and I was out in the yard, gathering all my equipment to store it in the shed for the winter. It was mostly tools and lawn mowers that I'd left out. While I was out there, I noticed something odd. A man was walking along the road that connects to my driveway. He didn't have any gear with him, no backpack, no camping supplies. To give some context, this road was empty most of the time with just a handful of houses, and the town was a good 4-hour walk away. I watched him for a bit until he disappeared far down the road. Once he was out of sight, I looked in both directions down the road and didn't see any cars. It struck me as strange, but after a while, I pushed it out of my mind and finished up in the yard. I was back inside before dark, made dinner, and relaxed for a while. While I was sitting down, a loud thud from outside startled me. It sounded like wood hitting wood, and it seemed to come from the direction of the shed. I got up and peeked through the window to find the shed door wide open. It was an old door, but it had never unlatched on its own before. Unsure of what was happening, I knew I needed to check and at least close the door. I grabbed my rifle just in case, though I didn't expect any real danger. As I stepped outside, I listened closely but didn't hear anything except the quiet of the night. I scanned the field but didn't see any signs of life, no animals or people. When I reached the shed, I turned on my flashlight and shined it inside. Everything looked normal. I stepped in and did a more thorough check, searching for any animals that might have gotten in, but found nothing. I closed the shed door securely and began heading back to the house. As I walked through the field toward the front door, an uneasy feeling started to creep over me. I couldn't quite place it, but the sense of something being off grew stronger as I got closer to the house. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. Walking into the hallway, I saw a shoe print on the floor. I flicked on the light, and to my horror, a line of dirty shoe prints stretched across the hallway, leading up to the spare bedroom. My heart started beating faster as I held my rifle up and took a deep breath, then carefully walked up to the door. I leaned my head against the wood and listened, hearing what sounded like someone breathing right on the other side. Before I could even think on what to do next, the handle twisted from my grip and the door swung open. I jumped back and held the rifle up, as a man looked like he was about to charge at me holding a huge metal shovel up. I think my gun stopped him in his tracks, though. He stood in the doorway holding the shovel like a weapon and having a face full of rage. I yelled as loud as I could him to stay back, trying to sound intimidating, but I was undoubtedly terrified. The man kept his distance, but his face full of anger never faded. From this moment, though, I didn't know what to do. Cops wouldn't be able to make it here for probably an hour if I called, and I definitely didn't want to hold him at gunpoint for that long, risking anything to happen. As we stood in a strange silence, the man suddenly threw the shovel in my direction, then sprinted back into the room. I ran in to see what he was doing and watched him start crawling out of the window. Part of me wanted to stop him, but another part of me couldn't get myself to. He jumped out and ran off into the field, escaping in the vast empty night with no way of knowing where he was running off to. To this day, that man has never been identified and his intentions are unknown. All I can say is that if I hadn't had my rifle in my hands or if he had gotten the jump on me, I likely wouldn't be here today. I grew up in a tiny rural town in Florida on a farm with a population of less than 1,000 people. The nearest city, Gainesville, was about an hour's drive away. The nights were pitch black, no streetlights or city glow, just the vast sky full of stars. My great-grandfather passed away when I was around 8 years old, which left my grandmother heartbroken. We lived just a field away from my great-grandmother, who was about 75 at the time. Unfortunately, she had begun showing early signs of Alzheimer's, and sometimes she wasn't quite herself. The rest of the family, aside from me, decided it would be best if I moved in with her so she wouldn't be alone in the evenings and at night. Granny lived in an old farmhouse that she had helped build with my granddaddy back in the 1930s. It was a wooden house with a tin roof. By then, we had electricity, but no air conditioning or telephone. The front door was wooden, with the top half consisting of a glass window pane, covered by a small decorative curtain at the very top, the kind you'd expect in a kitchen window. As you can imagine, Anyone could see inside the house as clearly as we could see outside. The door lock was the original one made by my granddaddy. It wasn't really a lock, but rather a piece of wood nailed to the frame that you turn horizontally when closing the door, just to prevent someone from pushing it open. I slept in the same room as Granny, and our bedroom was at the very front of the house, right next to the front door. My bed was pushed up against the window, which faced the front porch and yard. I always felt safe because our family, including aunts and uncles, lived on nearby farms. But in 1990, everything changed. By that time, I was 10 years old. Granny's memory was fading more, and she would sometimes wander the house at night. Then, something terrible happened in the nearby city. A man had broken into apartments occupied by college students in Gainesville, murdered them, and committed horrifying acts to their bodies. There were no suspects, and the police started referring to him as the Gainesville Ripper. Rumors spread through our community like wildfire. Some people said the killer was pretending to be a cable or electric worker to get people to open their doors. Fear and anxiety grew daily as the police had no leads. My dad decided it was time to teach me how to use our family weapon just in case. Dad took me out in the woods and I practiced. That night, I fell asleep with the weapon beside the head of my bed with clear instructions to not open the door for anyone we didn't know. As a 10-year-old, I felt like this was a pretty big responsibility and my anxiety kept me from sleeping much those next few nights. They reassured me that I would never have to use the weapon, but better to be safe than sorry. Until the next night, which was the most terrifying night of my life up until this point. I was laying in bed looking at the digital clock on Granny's dresser, 3 o'clock and 5 seconds a.m. in bright red digits. Granny had gotten up to wander around the kitchen. She did this often, and I just let her do what she thought she needed to do. I heard a tap on the front door window pane. I listened intently, and then silence. Suddenly the porch light flipped on, illuminating through my little window. What was Granny doing? I scurried out of bed to the front door just in time to reach for Granny's hand as she was trying to turn the piece of wood keeping the door locked. At the same time, I looked out the window, my eyes meeting the eyes of a strange man standing there. The porch light was behind him and I couldn't see his face very well. His hair was long and unkempt. I did not know him. He jiggled the handle and pushed hard on the door with all his weight. I was terrified and I excitedly screamed at Granny asking what she was doing. She told me Granddaddy was at the door. She sometimes thought Granddaddy was still alive. There was no convincing her it wasn't him. With the man pushing furiously against the door, I had to drag Granny with both hands into the bedroom so I could reach the weapon without giving her a chance to open the door. I grabbed the weapon and ran into the living room, aiming directly at the front door, my finger on the trigger. The stranger was gone. I had no telephone to call for help. We were trapped. I sat in the recliner by the front door, staring out into the darkness beyond the porch light, with weapon in hand for the rest of the night. Unable to swallow, shaking so hard I could barely aim the weapon, I waited for the man to return to try one of the flimsy windows or the back door. Every moving shadow, distant dog bark, bump in the night, or snap of a twig had my heart racing and blood rushing through my ears. The wind would blow and make the screen door creak open and fall shut with a bang. It was torture. My arms ached from holding the weapon. My nightgown was soaked with sweat, and I was on the verge of bursting into soul-wrenching sobs. But I had a job to do, guarding us from the Ripper. Oblivious, Granny tottered around the kitchen getting ready to make breakfast because Granddaddy would be wanting his coffee soon. I didn't argue or care what she did as long as she stayed away from that front door. I never saw another glimpse of the stranger, but I felt like he was out there, watching us. After staying wide awake all night terrified, holding vigil, I made sure Granny was back to sleep, slipped out the back door, and ran straight across the hayfields home to Mom and Dad for help once the sun came up in the morning. The police eventually caught the Gainesville Ripper, and it was not the same man I saw at our front door that night. My family hired an elderly lady to stay with Granny, and I moved home permanently. To this day, I don't know who was at the door on that pitch-black night, but I still panic, looking out of windows at night into the darkness. This story takes place when I was 17, though now I'm 21. I used to live in a small city in France with my mom and dog, in a quiet neighborhood where almost everyone knew each other. Most of the people around us were elderly, but just a few weeks before my story happened, a new family moved in next door. I don't remember seeing them much, but I would occasionally hear children laughing and playing in their yard. Every year in January, my mom would go on holiday for a month, traveling to different countries. My grandmother, who lived just 5 minutes away, would usually come and stay with me. But that year, I was old enough to stay by myself, so I did. At the time, I wasn't very sociable, but my best friend was. She always enjoyed meeting new people, so we decided to take advantage of my mom being away to throw a party at my place. It wasn't exactly a party, more like a pre-game session before everyone went to the club. I wasn't planning to go with them. I didn't really enjoy it, and the city center was far from home. My plan was just to invite everyone over, make some new friends, have some drinks, and then go to bed. The night came and everyone arrived. There were 3 girls and 5 guys. I was having a good time, though I was a bit anxious about the possibility of someone breaking in or someone getting sick on the carpet. But luckily, neither of those things happened. We were sitting on the terrace, chatting, drinking, and listening to music. Then, around 11 p.m., we heard a knock at the door. I figured it was probably a neighbor coming to complain about the noise. I told everyone to be quiet and turned the music down. One of the guys opened the door to see who it was and came back to tell me that my new neighbor was at the door and wanted to join the party. I was confused, so I went to the door to see for myself. There stood a man, maybe in his mid-30s. He was bald, wearing glasses, not tall but a bit corpulent, and holding a bottle of Jack Daniels. At first, I couldn't help but laugh, thinking it was bizarre that this man wanted to party with a group of teenagers. But sure enough, it was true. He told me he was new to the neighborhood and didn't know anyone. He was happy to see some young people and just wanted to share a drink with us. I understood since, as I mentioned, most of the people around us were elderly. I figured maybe we looked older than we actually were, so I told the man that everyone at the house was under 18 and made it clear that he wasn't really welcome. But everyone else thought he was just being friendly and didn't see any harm in it, so I was kind of swayed and agreed to let him sit with us on the terrace. Even though I still didn't feel fully comfortable, I asked him not to go into the house. One of the guys reassured me that he would keep an eye on him. The night continued, and everything seemed fine. The man was chatting with everyone, making jokes, laughing with the guys. He just seemed like a nice guy, even though I found it a bit strange that he would be hanging out with underage people while his wife and kids were likely waiting for him next door. But that was just my opinion. I started to relax and enjoy our time. Then at about 2 a.m., it was time for everybody to go to the club, for me to clean up a bit, and then I was going to head to bed. They all left at the same time, and the man left too, saying he was going home. We've been on the terrace most of the time, so the cleaning was fast. I closed the windows, locked the door, at least I thought I did at least, and went to bed watching Pretty Little Liars to fall asleep. 1 hour later, I heard a noise. Remember when I said I had a dog? Well, his tiny paws used to make a tip-tap noise when he was walking on the wooden floor. But I was so used to this noise that this time I knew it wasn't him walking on the floor. My room was on the 2nd floor, up on the ground floor, so I went out of bed, ran down the stairs, and stopped. The man was here in the middle of my house staring at me. This maybe lasted 2 seconds, then he ran out of the house and smashed the door behind him. I called the police straight away to tell them what happened. They told me to close my door, and that was it. I was paralyzed. I didn't know what to do. My mom was at the other end of the world and didn't know I was having a party at home. So I called my dad, who was living 10 minutes away, but he didn't answer. I took my fluffy shoes, closed my door with a key, and decided to run as fast as I could to my grandma's apartment. I barely had clothes on, running in the middle of the night, hoping that the guy wasn't following me. When I arrived, I didn't want my grandmother to have a heart attack, so I just stayed in the hallway lying on the floor and waiting for the morning to come. I called my friends to tell her. She was shocked and told me she was coming back to me, but she had to wait for the first bus about 6 in the morning. When the sun finally came up, I went back to my place and all the people who were there with me arrived too. They were determined to confront this neighbor. They knocked at his door, but he wasn't going to answer, so they broke his front gate, which literally fell on the floor. It was made with some terrible wood, so pretty easy to break. And then the man came and started shouting, and one of the guys punched him in the face. But that felt good to see. After this, everybody went home. I put my ideas back to place and went to the police to make a complaint against him. The police officer told me he was going to see him in the afternoon. After this, my dad asked why I called him at this time of the night, so I explained what happened and he went to see the man too. The problem is, the man didn't say the same version of my dad into the police. At first, he said he forgot his wallet in the house, which is impossible because I made sure that he didn't put a single foot inside the house. Then he said that he thought the party wasn't over, which is also impossible because he left at the same time as everybody else and knew I was staying home alone. I still don't know why he came back, and I'm not sure. I want to know. I was 14 when this happened, and my best friend Holly, who was 17, was with me. We were both very small and obviously very young at the time. It was a Friday night, and we were at one of Holly's friends' places for a little get-together. Even though we were underage, we drank way too much, and by the time we decided to head home around midnight, we were both unsteady on our feet. We live in a small city in Canada, and for the most part, it was pretty safe. I was spending the night at Holly's, and since we were both drunk, we took the short bus ride home. The closest bus stop was about 1 kilometer from her place. The bus stop was at a park and ride, with a well-lit parking lot, but the rest of the walk was on a quiet residential road with no streetlights. We had walked this route many times before and never thought twice about it on this particular night. We got off the bus, still drunk, and started walking back to Holly's. We passed through the parking lot, which had a few cars parked, and then began the walk into the dark residential area. So far, everything felt pretty normal, but I noticed that Holly got quiet and started walking faster. I thought she was just sobering up and eager to get home, so I kept pace with her. She glanced at me and, seeing that I hadn't noticed, told me she thought someone was following us. I turned around and saw a figure behind us at a distance, but still a person nonetheless. No one else had gotten off the bus with us, and no one was around when we disembarked, so we assumed this person must have come from the parking lot. We started to sober up quickly, but we tried to rationalize things and ignore our gut feelings. Every few seconds, we'd glance back to check, and we noticed that the person was getting closer. It became clear that the person was a man, an adult male, and we both started to panic as various scenarios ran through our minds. Holly then told me we needed to run. When we looked back again, the man had a bat. We didn't need any more prompting. We both bolted, and as I glanced behind me, I saw that he really did have a baseball bat. I can't remember if he was running or just walking quickly, but he was still coming after us. A horrible sense of urgency and panic overwhelmed me, and survival instincts kicked in. Holly and I both knew that we couldn't stop running until we were inside and had the door locked. I remember from running track that if you look behind you while running, you slow down. So despite all my instincts telling me to look, I kept my focus forward and kept running as fast as I could. After what felt like forever, we finally made it to Holly's house. We rushed inside, both shaking and crying, and luckily Holly's dad was awake. We told him what had happened, and he had us call the police while he got in his car. He wanted to drive around and see if he could spot the guy to get a better description for the authorities, but he never saw him. I'm not sure when we lost him or if he followed us all the way home, but nothing ever came of the situation. It's been over 10 years now since that night, and I try not to dwell on what could have happened. But the thought of a grown man sitting in his car with a baseball bat, waiting for vulnerable people to walk by, still gives me goosebumps. The first light of dawn had just started to filter through the thick tree canopy when it hit me. I was hopelessly lost. What was supposed to be a refreshing solo hike through the Cascade Mountains had quickly morphed into a nightmare, and I was about to find myself in a situation far worse than I could have ever expected. I've always prided myself on my ability to navigate the outdoors. Having grown up in the Pacific Northwest, I spent more time in the forest than I did in my own yard. But now, as I stood there, my well-worn hiking boots sinking slightly into the damp ground, a strange chill ran through me, one that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. The trail I'd been following for the past 2 days had gradually faded until it had vanished completely. I pushed on, sure that I could rely on the sun and my compass to guide me. But now, surrounded by towering pines and jagged rocks, everything seemed identical. I took a slow, steadying breath, trying to calm the panic rising in my chest. Stay calm, Jake, I told myself. Panic is your worst enemy. I decided to climb higher, hoping that from the top of a ridge, I might spot a familiar landmark or perhaps even catch a glimpse of the highway. The climb was grueling, my muscles protesting with every step. I was down to my last bottle of water, unsure of when I'd find a stream to replenish it. As I neared the ridge's peak, a noise froze me in my tracks. Voices, human voices. A wave of relief washed over me. Other hikers, maybe they could point me in the right direction. I picked up my pace, ignoring the burn in my legs, but as I drew closer, the voices became clearer, and the sense of relief quickly morphed into unease. These weren't the friendly, carefree sounds of people enjoying the wilderness. The voices were low, heated, and occasionally interrupted by the sharp clink of metal. I slowed my pace, moving as silently as possible. Years of hunting with my dad had taught me how to be stealthy in the woods. I crouched behind a large rock, peeking cautiously around it. What I saw next made my heart stop. In a small clearing about 50 yards away, 3 men were gathered around what appeared to be a makeshift laboratory. Plastic containers, tubes, and propane tanks were scattered about. One of the men was carefully measuring out a white powder while another stirred a pot that bubbled over a portable stove. I didn't need any scientific knowledge to recognize what I was witnessing. This was a meth lab, tucked away in the wilderness where it would be nearly impossible for anyone to find it, except for me. I held my breath, not daring to move. These men were dangerous, that much was obvious. If they caught me, I doubted they'd simply let me go on my way. Damn it, Tony. One of the men suddenly shouted, making me flinch. I told you to watch the temperature. You're gonna ruin the whole batch. Screw you, Mike. The man stirring the pot shot back. I know what I'm doing. Both of you shut up. The third man growled. He seemed to be the leader. We don't need any noise carrying. Last thing we need is some ranger stumbling on us. If only they knew how close they were to the truth. I knew I needed to get out of there and fast. But which way? I was lost to begin with, and now I had to factor in avoiding these criminals. One wrong move, one snapped twig, and I could be discovered. Slowly, carefully, I began to back away from my hiding spot. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure they must be able to hear it. Crack. The sound of a branch breaking under my foot was like a gunshot in the quiet forest. I froze, my whole body tensing. What was that? One of the men said sharply, "Probably just a deer." Another replied, but he didn't sound convinced. "Check it out," the leader commanded. Could be a bear attracted by the smell. I heard footsteps coming in my direction. Panic overtook me and I ran. I no longer cared about being quiet. All that mattered was putting as much distance between myself and those men as possible. Behind me, I heard shouts of alarm. They had spotted me. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through underbrush, leaping over fallen logs. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging cuts, but I didn't slow down. I could hear them pursuing me, their heavy footfalls and angry shouts spurring me on. I had no idea where I was going. My only thought was to keep moving, to not let them catch me. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were on fire, but fear kept me going. Suddenly, the ground disappeared from under my feet. I had run right off the edge of a steep incline. I tumbled down the slope, my world becoming a dizzying blur of earth and sky. I came to a stop at the bottom. The breath knocked out of me. For a moment, I lay there dazed and gasping for air. Then I heard the voices again, closer now. Ignoring the pain radiating through my body, I forced myself to my feet and started running again. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees becoming a green blur as I ran. I had no idea how long I'd been running or how far I'd gone. My throat was raw. my mouth dry as dust, but still I pushed on. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I burst out of the tree line and onto a road, an actual paved road. I could have cried with relief, but I wasn't safe yet. I could still hear shouts in the distance. They were still after me. I looked up and down the road, praying to see a car, a truck, anything. But it was deserted, left with no other choice. I started running down the road. It had to lead somewhere, right? To civilization, to safety. I don't know how long I ran along that road. Time seemed to lose all meaning. My whole world narrowed down to the rhythmic pounding of my feet on the asphalt and the burning in my lungs. And then, like a mirage in the desert, I saw it. A gas station. Never in my life had I been so happy to see one of those garish neon signs. I staggered into the parking lot, startling an old man filling up his pickup truck. "Please," I gasped out, my voice hoarse. "I need help. Call the police." The man took one look at me, wild-eyed, covered in cuts and bruises, gasping for breath, and hurried into the store. Moments later, he came back out with the clerk, who was already on the phone with 911. As I sank to the ground, my legs finally giving out, I heard the clerk describing my condition to the dispatcher. The old man draped his jacket over my shoulders, murmuring words of comfort. It wasn't until I heard the wail of approaching sirens that I finally allowed myself to relax. I was safe. I had made it. The aftermath was a blur of police statements and medical checks. I told the authorities everything I had seen, and they assured me they would investigate. They found the lab, abandoned but with clear evidence of recent activity. The men, however, had vanished into the vast wilderness. It took me a long time to feel comfortable in the woods again after that. The forest, once my sanctuary, had become a place of terror, but slowly I found my way back. I still hike, still seek out the solitude of nature. But now I'm always aware that even in the most remote places, you're never truly alone. And sometimes that's not a comforting thought at all. In 2012, I was just a regular college student. I had a few odd experiences here and there, but I remained pretty skeptical about the paranormal. That all changed when I found out I was pregnant. My boyfriend and I decided to get married, and we started looking for a place to live. Miraculously, we found a duplex just a block from my parents' house. It was cheap, allowed dogs, and seemed perfect for us. If you've ever watched A Haunting, you probably know where this story is headed. At the time, though, we were just relieved to find a place that fit our budget. The one strange thing was how many people had moved in and out of that particular unit, while the guy downstairs had lived there for over a decade. We'd only been living there a couple of weeks when I asked my husband if he had moved something of mine. When he said no, I jokingly mentioned that maybe we had a ghost. My husband froze. I asked him what was wrong, and he admitted that he hadn't wanted to scare me. But the other night, while we were in bed, he had looked up and saw what appeared to be a man standing in the other room. He said he got up to check, but when he went into the room, there was no one there. I was creeped out by this, but since I hadn't seen anything myself, I convinced myself it was all in his head. The next few months were a whirlwind of baby preparations, so we didn't notice any more activity for a while. In October, our son was born, and we were so consumed with adjusting to parenthood that ghosts weren't on our minds. However, my iPod went missing, and we assumed it had just been stolen. Then, on Christmas morning, I put the baby on our bed while I went to help my husband with breakfast. We heard him crying, so we both rushed back into the room to check on him. To our shock, he had stopped crying, something he never did on his own. We stood in the doorway and watched as our baby interacted with something we couldn't see. He was laughing, reaching toward it, and following something with his eyes. This went on for a few minutes, and we just watched, not sure what to make of it. Around that same time, we had to replace our mattress. When we took the old one off, we discovered my stolen iPod in the middle of the box spring. To this day, I have no idea how it ended up there. After that, weird things started happening more frequently. I became terrified of being home alone. One time, while I was sitting in the living room, a rock was thrown at me. I checked everywhere, but I swear, There was nobody there. Once, I felt a ghostly hand reach around the doorframe. As my son got older, he started talking about someone named Boo. One day, someone asked him who he lived with, and he replied, Mama, Daddy, Papa, and Boo. I also saw him hand toys to someone I couldn't see, only for the toys to fall to the ground, which upset him. On one occasion, while I was giving him a bath, he looked up excitedly, pointed, and shouted, Boo! I stood up, trying to see what he was pointing at, but I found nothing except a pocket of cold, icy air in the otherwise steamy bathroom. Things in the house would constantly go missing, only to turn up in places we had already looked. It drove us crazy and added to the strain in our relationship. We started arguing all the time, and my husband became paranoid, accusing me of all sorts of things. The house had a basement where we kept the washer and dryer. I was always creeped out down there, so I'd have our dog keep me company while I did laundry. One night, as I was putting clothes in the dryer, I heard my dog growl. When I looked up, I saw him staring at a dark corner of the basement, growling furiously. Then, out of nowhere, he was knocked backward, yelping in pain. He quickly got up and ran, whimpering up the stairs, and I followed him. Eventually, my son and I moved out of that house when my husband and I decided to get divorced. Thankfully, we haven't experienced any paranormal activity where we live now. Interestingly, after my ex moved out of the house, our relationship improved. We went from barely speaking to becoming friends and co-parenting successfully. I still scratch my head at some of the things that happened there, but I'm so relieved that we're no longer living in that house. The moment I bit into that potato salad, I knew something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just the unexpected taste of meat where there shouldn't have been any. It was the way my neighbors were watching me, their eyes glinting with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I should have trusted my gut and left right then, but I didn't, and that decision nearly cost me everything. I'd moved into the neighborhood about 6 months ago, hoping to find some peace and quiet after a messy divorce. The streets were tree-lined, the houses well-kept, and the neighbors seemed friendly enough. They'd wave as I walked by or offer a quick hello when we crossed paths at the local shops. But there was always something unsettling about their smiles. Too wide, too fixed, like they were wearing masks they couldn't quite control. I'd managed to keep to myself for the most part, politely declining invitations to book clubs and neighborhood watch meetings. But when Sarah, the unofficial leader of the block, knocked on my door with an invitation to the annual potluck, I found myself agreeing before I could stop myself. "Oh, wonderful," she'd said, her smile stretching just a bit too wide. "We've all been so looking forward to getting to know you better. Don't forget to bring a dish." The day of the potluck arrived, and I found myself standing in Sarah's backyard, holding a bowl of hastily made pasta salad. Long tables were groaning under the weight of countless dishes, and the air was alive with conversation and the clinking of cutlery. I hovered at the edge of the gathering, feeling out of place. The other neighbors moved around with ease, laughing and chatting as they filled their plates. I recognized a few faces: Bob from 2 doors down, the elderly couple from across the street, the young family from the corner house. They all seemed so normal. Maybe I had been too quick to judge. Maybe this was exactly what I needed to feel more at home in the neighborhood. Deciding to make an effort, I approached the food tables. That's when I noticed something odd. Almost every dish seemed to have meat in it, but not in the typical ways you'd expect at a barbecue. There was meat in the coleslaw, chunks of it floating in what looked like jello, even what appeared to be a meat-based fruit pie. My vegetarian pasta salad felt out of place. "Try the potato salad," a voice said beside me, making me jump. It was Sarah, her ever-present smile firmly in place. "It's my grandmother's recipe, a real neighborhood favorite." Not wanting to be rude, I scooped a small portion onto my plate. The potato salad looked normal enough, creamy white with flecks of herbs. But as I took a bite, my taste buds rebelled. Hidden among the potatoes were chunks of something meaty, with a texture I couldn't quite place. I must have made a face because Sarah's smile faltered for just a moment. Is something wrong? She asked, her voice honey-sweet, but with an undercurrent I couldn't quite place. No, no, I lied, forcing myself to swallow. It's interesting. I just wasn't expecting meat in the potato salad. Sarah's smile returned, wider than ever. Oh, we put meat in everything around here. It's kind of our thing. You'll get used to it. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I looked around, I realized she was right. Every neighbor's plate was piled high with the meat-laden dishes, but something else caught my attention. While they all seemed to be eating enthusiastically, making appreciative noises and going back for seconds, I didn't actually see anyone swallow. A chill ran down my spine. I set my plate down, suddenly not hungry at all. I think I need some water, I mumbled, heading towards the drinks table. As I walked, I felt eyes on me. Glancing back, I saw several neighbors watching me intently. Their gazes followed my every move, and their smiles seemed to have taken on a predatory edge. At the drinks table, I poured myself a glass of water with shaking hands. As I raised it to my lips, I caught sight of my reflection in the pitcher. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw something else reflected there. Not the faces of my smiling neighbors, but something twisted, inhuman. I dropped the glass, water splashing across my shoes. The conversation around me stuttered to a halt, and I felt every eye in the yard turn towards me. Is everything all right, dear? Sarah's voice came from right behind me, making me jump. She placed a hand on my shoulder, and it took every ounce of self-control not to flinch away. Her touch felt wrong somehow. Too cold, too firm. I'm not feeling well. I managed to stammer out. I think I should go home. Sarah's grip on my shoulder tightened. Oh, but you can't leave now. The party's just getting started, and you haven't even tried the main course yet. I turned to face her, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Sarah's smile had grown impossibly wide, stretching from ear to ear, and her eyes were completely black, like empty voids in her face. I jerked away from her, my heart pounding in my chest. As I looked around wildly, I saw that all my neighbors had undergone a similar transformation. Their faces were distorted, their smiles too wide, their eyes dark and hungry. What's going on? I demanded, my voice shaking. What are you people? Bob from 2 doors down stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice was a low growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. We're just your friendly neighborhood welcoming committee, and you, my dear, are the guest of honor. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran, pushing past grasping hands and ignoring the chorus of inhuman voices calling for me to stay. I sprinted across the yard, vaulted over the fence, and didn't stop running until I reached my house. I slammed the door behind me, locking it and sliding the chain into place. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage it. Through the window, I could see figures moving on the street. My neighbors walking with an unnatural jerky gait, all heading in my direction. I ran upstairs, grabbing my phone to call the police. But when I dialed 911, all I got was a busy signal. I tried again and again, each time met with the same result. A knock at the door made me jump. Come out, dear. Sarah's voice called, sickly sweet. We just want to welcome you properly to the neighborhood. It won't hurt much. I looked around frantically, searching for a way out the window. I could climb out onto the roof and maybe make it to my car. But as I approached the window, I saw more neighbors in my backyard. Their distorted faces turned up towards me waiting. I was trapped. The knocking at the door grew louder, more insistent. I could hear wood splintering as they began to force their way in. In desperation, I barricaded myself in the bathroom, pushing the heavy vanity in front of the door. I sat on the edge of the tub, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen in real life. Any moment now, I'd wake up and realize this was all just a terrible nightmare. But the sounds of my neighbors forcing their way into my house were all too real. I could hear them moving through the rooms downstairs, calling out to me in sing-song voices that didn't even try to sound human anymore. As I sat there, trembling, my eyes fell on the small window above the toilet. It was tiny, probably too small for me to fit through, but it was my only chance. I had just started to pry it open when the bathroom door shuddered under a heavy impact. Wood cracked, and I saw fingers, unnaturally long and tipped with sharp claws, curl around the edge of the door. "Here's Johnny," Bob's voice called out, followed by a chorus of inhuman laughter. In a panic, I squeezed myself through the window, scraping my sides raw as I did. I tumbled onto the roof, rolling dangerously close to the edge before I managed to stop myself. Below me, the yard was full of my neighbors, all staring up at me with those awful, too-wide smiles. But they seemed unwilling, or perhaps unable, to climb up after me. I shuffled along the roof, heading for the large oak tree that stretched over my driveway. With a silent prayer, I leapt, grabbing a branch and swinging myself down to land heavily on the hood of my car. I didn't hesitate. I jumped into the driver's seat, silently thanking whatever higher power might be listening that I'd left my keys in the car. The engine roared to life, and I sped out of the driveway, sideswiping Bob as he lunged toward the car. In my rearview mirror, I saw my neighbors standing in the street, watching me as I drove away. They didn't chase me. They didn't even try to follow. They just stood there, smiling those impossible smiles, as though they knew something I didn't. I drove all night, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that nightmare of a neighborhood. I never went back. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? Sometimes, late at night, I still dream of those smiles, of meat where it shouldn't be, of neighbors who aren't quite human. And I wonder how many other neighborhoods are just like mine. How many unsuspecting people are sitting down to potlucks, unaware that they're the main course. So, if you ever move to a new neighborhood and get invited to a potluck, pay close attention to what's on the menu. And if everything seems to have meat in it, even the things that shouldn't, run. Run and don't look back. The first crack of thunder made me jump, but it was the second sound, the low, guttural moan that seemed to come from deep within the very walls of the old barn, that froze my blood. I'd sought shelter from the storm, but as the shadows around me began to move in ways shadows shouldn't, I realized with chilling clarity that I'd walked straight into a nightmare. It had started as a simple camping trip, a chance to clear my head after a messy breakup and the stress of losing my job. Just me, my tent, and the great outdoors. I'd chosen a remote spot in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, the perfect place to reconnect with nature and forget about my problems for a while. The first 2 days had been exactly what I needed. The fresh air, the quiet, the simple routine of gathering firewood and cooking over an open flame. I felt more relaxed than I had in months. But on the third day, everything changed. I woke up to dark clouds rolling in, the air thick with the promise of rain. I should have packed up right then, headed back to civilization. But I convinced myself it was just a passing shower. I could wait it out. By mid-afternoon, I realized I'd made a mistake. The wind picked up, howling through the trees with a ferocity that bent branches and sent leaves spiraling through the air. The first drops of rain were fat and heavy, quickly turning into a downpour that had me scrambling to secure my tent. It was a losing battle. Within minutes, my campsite was a soggy mess. I needed better shelter, and fast. That's when I remembered the old barn I'd passed on my hike the day before. It was about a mile away, but it was my best option. I grabbed my backpack, shoved in what essentials I could, and set off through the worsening storm. By the time I reached the barn, I was soaked to the bone and shivering. The structure loomed in front of me, a dark silhouette against the gray sky. It seemed larger than I remembered. In the gloom of the storm, it looked far more ominous than it had in the bright daylight. I hesitated at the entrance, suddenly unsure. There was something unsettling about the place, a stillness that felt wrong even with the storm raging outside. Another crack of thunder made the decision for me. I ducked inside, grateful for the shelter from the rain. The interior was dim, lit only by the occasional flash of lightning through the gaps in the wooden walls. The air was thick with the smell of damp hay and something else, something musty and unpleasant that I couldn't quite place. I moved deeper into the barn, my eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness. Old farm equipment cast strange shadows, and I could hear the scurrying of small animals in the corners. But overall, it seemed dry and secure, a decent place to wait out the storm. I found a relatively clean patch of hay and sat down, rummaging in my backpack for a dry shirt. That's when I heard it, a sound so faint I thought I'd imagined it at first. A whisper, like someone exhaling a long, slow breath. I froze, my hands still in my backpack. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the empty barn. "Is someone there?" No response, just the howling of the wind outside and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. I shook my head, laughing nervously at my own jumpiness. Of course, no one was here. It was just an old, empty barn in the middle of nowhere. I changed into my dry clothes and tried to get comfortable. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and I resigned myself to spending the night here. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being out in that downpour. As night fell, the darkness in the barn became absolute. My flashlight cast a weak beam that seemed to be swallowed up by the shadows. I kept it on, a small circle of light that did little to dispel the growing sense of unease that was settling over me. That's when the noises started. At first, it was just creaks and groans, old wood settling, I told myself. But then came sounds I couldn't explain away so easily. Scratching noises from the walls, soft thuds from the hayloft above, and worst of all, that whispering sound again, closer now, like someone was standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I pulled my knees to my chest, my eyes darting around wildly. This wasn't right. I shouldn't be here. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, storm or no storm. But where would I go? I was miles from anywhere in the middle of a forest I barely knew, in pitch darkness and pouring rain. A particularly loud thud from above made me yelp. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in the hayloft. A dark shape, too big to be an animal, ducking out of sight. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "This isn't funny." That's when the whispering started again, but this time I could make out words. "Join us," it seemed to say, the sound coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Stay with us." I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This couldn't be happening. I had to be dreaming or hallucinating, or a hand touched my shoulder. I screamed, spinning around and swinging my flashlight like a weapon. The beam caught something, a face pale and gaunt with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. It grinned at me, revealing teeth that were far too sharp to be human. I ran. I didn't plan, just ran blindly toward where I thought the door was. I could hear movement all around me now, the rustling of hay and the creaking of floorboards as unseen things gave chase. I slammed into the barn door with enough force to knock the wind out of me, fumbling with the latch in panic. It wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Hands grabbed at me from behind, cold and strong. I thrashed and kicked, somehow breaking free. In desperation, I threw myself at one of the walls where I'd seen gaps in the planks. The old wood gave way with a splintering crack, and suddenly I was outside, rain lashing at my face. I didn't stop to see if I was being followed. I just ran, stumbling through the dark forest, branches whipping at my face and arms. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. When I finally stopped gasping for breath, I realized I had no idea where I was. The storm still raged around me, but it was preferable to what I'd left behind in that barn. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of my situation sank in. I was lost in the woods in the middle of a storm with no supplies and no idea which way to go. But even that seemed better than going back. I started walking, picking a direction at random and hoping it would lead me to a road, a house, anything. As I trudged through the rain, my mind kept replaying what I'd seen in the barn. Couldn't have been real. Maybe I'd eaten some bad berries or hit my head, or a distant sound made me stop in my tracks. Was that a car engine? Hope surged through me. I changed direction, moving as fast as I could toward the sound. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I burst out of the tree line onto a road. Headlights appeared in the distance. I waved my arms frantically, praying they'd see me. The car slowed, then stopped. An older couple peered out at me, concern evident on their faces. "Are you all right, son?" the man asked as I approached. I opened my mouth to explain, but how could I? How could I tell them about the horrors in the barn without sounding completely insane? "I got lost," I managed to say. "Can you help me get to town?" They were kind enough to give me a ride. As we drove away, I kept looking back, half expecting to see pale faces and sharp-toothed grins in the rearview mirror. But there was nothing but darkness and rain. I never went camping again after that night. Sometimes when the wind howls just right, I can still hear those whispers. "Join us," they say. "Stay with us." And I know with a certainty that chills me to my core, that somewhere out there in a forest I'll never visit again, there's an old barn waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to seek shelter from the storm. The first sign that something was terribly off was the unsettling quiet. The second, the half-finished meals left on the tables. It was as though the entire village had disappeared mid-bite. By the time night arrived and the shadows began to stir, we realized that what we thought was a simple discovery of an abandoned village was quickly turning into a desperate battle for survival. It was meant to be just a casual 3-day trek through the Appalachian wilderness. Just me and my 4 closest friends, Mike, Sarah, Alex, and Jess, taking a break from the chaos of city life and reconnecting with nature. We'd done similar trips before, but nothing could have prepared us for the horrifying scene that awaited us on the second day. The morning had begun like any other. We packed up camp at dawn, the air crisp and invigorating, filled with the anticipation of adventure. As we hiked, we laughed and shared stories, our voices echoing in the quiet of the dense forest. It wasn't until the afternoon that things took an unsettling turn. "Hey, guys," Mike called out, peering down at his GPS. "I think we're off track." We gathered around him, squinting at the small screen. According to the map, we should have been deep in untouched forest, but instead, a clearing appeared up ahead, barely visible through the trees. "Maybe it's just not on the map," Sarah suggested. "Could be an old logging camp or something." Driven by curiosity, we decided to investigate. But as we emerged from the tree line, we were frozen in place by what we saw. It wasn't a logging camp. It was a village, hidden deep in the woods. A collection of buildings stood like something out of a bygone era. Wooden cabins with thatched roofs lined dirt paths. And at the center was what appeared to be a town square, complete with a well and a small chapel. "This can't be real," Alex muttered, expressing the disbelief we all felt. "How is this not on any map?" We cautiously moved forward, calling out in hopes of someone answering. But the village remained silent, with only the rustling of leaves in the wind breaking the stillness. As we wandered further, the feeling that something was terribly wrong grew stronger. Everything appeared to be lived in, as if the people who had called this place home had only just left. Laundry still hung on clotheslines, swaying gently in the breeze. The gardens were well kept, vegetables hanging heavy on the vines. Yet there wasn't a single person in sight. "Guys," Jess called from one of the cabins. "You need to see this." We crowded into the small dwelling and saw what had caught her attention. The table was set for dinner, plates filled with now moldy food. Chairs were pushed back haphazardly, as if the diners had left in a hurry. "What the hell happened here?" I murmured, a chill running down my spine despite the warm afternoon sun. We split up to search the rest of the village, agreeing to meet back in the square in an hour. As I explored, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I turned around, I expected to see someone standing there, but the village remained deserted. In one cabin, I found a diary. The last entry was dated just a week ago. It spoke of strange noises in the night, of livestock going missing, of an overwhelming sense of dread. The final words sent a shiver through me. "They're coming. God help us all." When we regrouped, everyone had similar stories. Alex had found more half-eaten meals. Sarah discovered a schoolhouse with lessons still written on the blackboard. Mike had explored the chapel and found it set up for a service that never happened. We need to leave, Jess said, her voice shaking slightly. Something bad happened here, and I don't think we want to be around when night falls. But as we turned to go, we realized with growing horror that the sun was already setting. Somehow, hours had passed without us noticing. The forest beyond the village had grown dark and forbidding. We can't go stumbling through the woods at night, Mike argued. We'll break our necks. So what, we stay here? Alex countered, gesturing at the empty village. In this creepy ghost town. In the end, we didn't have much choice. We chose a cabin near the edge of the village, one with a clear view of the path back to the forest. We barricaded the door and windows as best we could, then settled in for an uneasy night. No one slept. We sat in a tight circle, flashlights at the ready, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. As the hours crawled by, the silence of the village grew oppressive. It was just past midnight when we heard it. A sound so faint at first that I thought I was imagining it. But then it came again, a soft shuffling, like something being dragged across the ground. Do you hear that? Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. We all nodded, too scared to speak. The sound was getting closer, coming from the direction of the village square. And it wasn't alone. Other noises joined it. A low moan, the clatter of something heavy falling, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, lots of footsteps. Jess was the first to peek through a crack in the barricaded window. She recoiled almost immediately, her face pale in the dim light of our flashlights. Oh God, she breathed. They're people, but not people. Something's wrong with them. One by one, we looked. What we saw defied explanation. Figures moved through the village square, their movements jerky and unnatural. In the moonlight, their skin looked gray and mottled. Some were missing limbs. Others had gaping wounds that should have been fatal. But they moved with purpose, searching. Zombies, Alex whispered incredulously. Are we seriously dealing with zombies right now? But we all knew that wasn't quite right. These weren't the mindless, shambling corpses of movies. These things moved with an unsettling coordination, as if guided by some unseen intelligence. As we watched, frozen in horror, one of the creatures paused. It turned slowly, its head swiveling until it was facing directly at our cabin. A sound emerged from its throat. Not quite a growl, not quite a word, but it was a call. And the others answered. We need to go, I said, already moving to unbarricade the door. Now, we burst out of the cabin just as the first of the creatures reached it. The cool night air was filled with their moans, the sound chilling me to my core. We ran, not towards the forest path, but deeper into the village. It was our only chance to lose them in the maze of buildings and find another way out. What followed was a nightmare of narrow escapes and heart-stopping terror. We darted from shadow to shadow, always just one step ahead of our pursuers. At one point, we got separated. I found myself alone in what looked like a workshop, the sound of those things scratching at the door. I was certain I was going to die there, torn apart by whatever these creatures were. But then I heard Mike's voice calling my name. Somehow, I found the strength to break a window and climb out, reuniting with my friends just in time to flee from another group of the monsters. As dawn broke, we finally found our way back to the forest path. The creatures seemed unable or unwilling to follow us past the village boundary. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, collapsing in a clearing far from that accursed place. We eventually made it back to civilization, but no one believed our story. When the authorities finally conducted an investigation, they found no evidence of the village, like it had never been there at all. Yet, in my dreams, I still hear the chilling moans, still see those desperate hands reaching for me. We never went on another hike after that. How could we, knowing that something might be hiding in the wilds, waiting to be discovered? There are nights when I can't help but think about that village. Where did it come from? What happened to the people who lived there? And most unsettling of all, is it still out there, lying in wait for the next group of unwary hikers to cross its cursed path? I don't have any answers, but there's one truth I hold on to. Some places are better left untouched, and some mysteries should never be unraveled. Because deep in the forest, in the forgotten corners of the world, Horrors exist that defy understanding. And once you've encountered them, you can never erase the memory. All you can do is try to survive. This happened when I was 20 years old. I've always been someone who stands out with my appearance, but I've also always been known for being friendly and loud. I'm not the type of person you'd expect someone to try something with. Not to say I'm unattractive, but I've always thought of myself as average. Black hair, coffee-colored eyes, pale skin. The real thing that stood out at the time, though, was my obsession with thrash metal. Even though I'm on the shorter side, I'd wear trucker hats with the bills flipped up, ripped jean jackets covered in patches and studs, and if you saw me at a concert, I was definitely in the mosh pit, throwing punches. I wasn't dating anyone at the time, but I was consistently talking to a guy I liked. I also enjoyed taking evening walks around my neighborhood, which was a decent middle-income area my parents managed to move us to after my dad worked overtime and won a lawsuit at his job. I'd made a few friends in the neighborhood, and it wasn't unusual for me to stop by unannounced at a friend's house to play some Mario Kart or smoke a bit. After an uneventful visit to a friend's place, where they weren't home, I decided to take a walk down the long stretch of golf course. I wasn't ready to head home yet. I was walking, listening to Slayer on my headphones, when I noticed a black Range Rover slowly driving behind me. I assumed they were just checking out the golf course, maybe curious about its size. But then the horn of another car honked behind the Range Rover, forcing it to move forward. I kept walking, not thinking too much about it, until I noticed the Range Rover had made a U-turn and was now following me again, crawling behind me. It circled maybe 2 more times. I pulled one earphone out and glanced at the car. The driver immediately seemed uncomfortable and sped off again. That's when I got that gut feeling, that instinct that tells you something isn't right. So, I started speed walking toward the nearby liquor store. I ducked inside and gave the owner a quick nod of acknowledgement, since we knew each other pretty well by this point. Just then, I heard a car door shut outside, and I saw the guy from the Range Rover walking toward the store. I told the owner I needed to use the bathroom, which was an employee-only restroom, and he reluctantly agreed. I quickly got into the bathroom, which had a good view of the store, and cracked the door open, turning off the lights so I could still see out. The guy walked into the store. I had never seen him before. He looked to be about my age, tall, with dark hair and blue eyes. He approached the owner and told him that he was looking for his little sister, claiming she had run away from home and that his parents were worried sick. He said she would probably fight back if he tried to approach her, and that he didn't want to alert her to his presence. Then he started describing me in detail, my custom jean jacket, my beat-up Nikes, my mirrored aviators, and even my facial features. I felt a sick knot in my stomach. Who was this guy? I had never seen him in my life. He left when the owner said he hadn't seen anyone matching that description, and I watched him walk back to his car, scanning the parking lot as he did. I heard the car start and pull out of the lot. I came out of the bathroom and made eye contact with the owner, who seemed just as unsettled as I was. I quietly said, "That guy is not my brother." I'm not sure what he wanted from me or why he'd made up such an elaborate story, but I've come to the conclusion that it couldn't have been anything good. I'm honestly not sure where to start with this because there's just so much to unpack. I'll do my best to explain without going on for too long, but I should first mention that I've always been sensitive to things like this. It's hard to describe without sounding, well, completely crazy, but I sometimes pick up on things. It's usually just a feeling or a physical response to certain places or people. My family's home has a long history of abuse spanning several generations, which resulted in a lot of horrifying experiences, both paranormal and not. My family had old-fashioned, oppressive beliefs, especially about how women were treated. I think the combination of my past and the environment I grew up in has made me more attuned to subtle changes in the atmosphere around me. What I mean is, I can pick up on the emotional state of the people around me very easily. For example, I could tell when my father came home just by how heavy and oppressive the house would feel. I could tell when I needed to hide or stay outside most of the time because it would feel like the air was filled with sharp electric tension, almost like hot pins. It would put you on edge. You could sense when he was angry before you even saw or heard him. It was like waiting for something to fall and shatter, knowing nothing good would come of it. There was also a lot of death, not just in my home but throughout the entire town. There was no escaping it until I was much older. I grew up in an old mining town, one that didn't become a ghost town after the gold rush. The big mine is still in operation today, although most of the others are closed. The part of the town I lived in was one of the original buildings, and much of it was built on native land. I later found out that some of the homes in my old neighborhood were built on old burial grounds, while others were constructed before the town even existed. There was also a high number of deaths from tuberculosis in addition to everything else. My family is part of the first generation of miners who worked in the town and are still living there today. We've had 5 generations in the same home, but recently, my parents put it on the market. Honestly, I hope no one buys it. If I had the money, I'd buy it myself and keep it empty forever. I honestly hope it burns to the ground before anyone else sets foot in it. Now, as for the paranormal stuff, it's difficult to know where to begin with everything that's happened, so I'll start with my very first memory of anything unusual when I was 4 years old. One morning, I woke up to a woman singing to me, just like she did every night. She sang in a beautiful language I had never heard before. But this time it felt different, sad, like something was wrong. For some reason, I felt like I had to follow her, and so I did. A side note, all the rooms in the house were connected to the open living room or kitchen, which was heated by the stove and cooled by the root cellar connected to the kitchen pantry. The house was shaped like a giant rectangle, with the kitchen at the center left and the front door at the bottom left. So, when I reached the kitchen living room, the woman waved and smiled, like she was about to leave. But the thing is, I thought she was as real as anyone else. I don't remember her ever speaking to me in English or Spanish, even though I grew up in a multilingual home where both languages were common. What I remember most was the overwhelming feeling of love from her. She was always there for me, especially during difficult times. She would sing me to sleep, comfort me when I was scared, and just be a presence of safety in my life. When she was about to leave, I couldn't handle it. I started crying and begged her not to go. I still remember the look on her face, even after all these years, 30 years to be exact. She gave me that sad, gentle smile, then turned toward the door. But instead of walking out the door, she walked through the wall where the door used to be, before the extra rooms were added. I didn't know this was even the case until I was in my 20s. After that, I never saw her again. I never heard her sing again either. Sometimes, I still get so sad thinking about that morning. I don't know where she went, but I hope one day I'll get to see her again. My mother found me still crying after a while. I knew it wouldn't end well if I told her what had happened, so I never spoke about it to her, and I probably never will. After that day, things just started getting worse. It was like a small hole opened up in our home, and little by little, things started leaking through. My uncle became gravely ill not long after, and he died in the very room I had been sleeping in. We switched rooms every few years, so I didn't have the same room for too long. Even though I was still young, I remember the way he passed so clearly. It was a traumatic death, not peaceful at all. I remember him coughing up blood, trying to pretend that everything was fine. One morning, I woke up to my grandmother telling me that he had passed away in the night and had already been taken by the morticians. Afterward, my family and visitors began seeing him around the house. My grandmother was often heard crying and telling him to move on, that he needed to be in heaven. I'll never forget her telling him, "You'll make the angels cry if you don't move on," over and over. A few months later, I moved into the room where he had died. We were very poor, and I had no choice but to take the bed he passed away in, or sleep on the cold floor. The first night I slept in there, I couldn't fall asleep at all. There was a shadow in the room that just wouldn't let me rest. It felt wrong, something new and terrifying. It wasn't my uncle, but it was definitely something I couldn't understand. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep out of sheer exhaustion. I was suddenly woken up by a sensation of being dropped onto the bed from at least a foot or more. I bounced a few times. The impact was enough to jolt me awake. When I opened my eyes, I saw something I can't quite describe, blackness all around me. It wasn't like smoke, but it moved just like smoke. It was pure black, like the absence of light itself. I remember jumping out of bed, too terrified to do anything but watch that shadow disappear into the center of the mattress. I couldn't go back to that room after that, so I went to sleep with my brother in his cart, then later on the floor in his room when he became too big for his bed. I never slept in that room again. From that point on, I always felt this oppressive, dark presence watching me every time I walked past that room. I couldn't bring myself to even look into the doorway anymore. It was like when someone is so heavy with negativity that you can't help but stare at the floor and avoid looking them in the eye. Sometimes it felt like the darkness would dare you to look at it. Occasionally, things would be thrown around, and there would be these moments where it felt like it was rushing toward you, screaming things at you. There were many nights when dishes from the kitchen would be thrown into different rooms. Sometimes mine, sometimes the other kids' rooms. Grandma's room and the bathroom were the only ones with doors, so we started making it a rule that nothing could be left on the countertops, and all the cupboards were locked with front door latches. The latches would hook and stay closed, and they couldn't be opened without some effort. Even the fridge was locked for some reason. We'd wake up to find milk and other things thrown into the living room or bedrooms. It got so bad that Grandma called the priest to come over every weekend, and he did until she got too old and sick and had to go to a nursing facility. When he stopped coming, and after Grandma passed away, it was like a dam broke. Everything went completely out of control. Now, I'm not religious, but I really feel like that priest was holding something back, something bad that had full control again once he was gone. There was a lot more breaking of things, mostly vases and cups. It felt like there was just more activity after he stopped visiting, and it seemed to gather around the cellar and the kitchen pantry. This is already getting long, and there's still so much more to share. I'll post again later and try to tell 1 or 2 more stories at a time. I'll answer as many questions as you guys have in the comments. Thanks so much for listening. It's hard to talk about all of this because, well, I know how unreal it sounds. There's so much that happened there, and some of it I don't think I'll ever be able to put into words. Everything seems fake, even to me. If it weren't for so many family members witnessing it all, I wouldn't believe it was real either, and I'd think I was just crazy or hallucinating or something. I'll stop here for tonight, but I'll be back to share more. I'm a massage therapist and I work for myself, often going to clients' homes at night. Whenever I have a new client, I bring my boyfriend along as backup. One evening, I had a session at a new client's condo in a nice area of Arizona. It was around 8 p.m. when I arrived. I got out of the truck, grabbed my bag, and started looking for the apartment. It was one of those massive complexes, and of course, the apartment numbers were barely visible. As I walked around, I noticed that every light I passed would flicker as soon as I walked by. It was like the light was fine one moment, then started flickering the next. I had this uneasy feeling that someone was watching me, but I brushed it off and quickly found the condo. My session lasted about 90 minutes, and when I packed up to head back to the truck, I noticed something strange. It wasn't in the spot where my boyfriend had parked it. I called him and he said something had happened, but he was on his way. When he arrived, he looked extremely pale, and his hands were shaking. I asked what happened. He told me that as I was walking toward the apartments, he saw a girl behind me, walking in sync with me, almost like a shadow. He said he looked down to light a cigarette, and by the time he looked back up, neither of us were in his line of sight anymore. About halfway through his cigarette, he saw someone pass by the truck quickly in the rearview mirror. He said it was the same girl. At that point, he was starting to feel a bit freaked out, but nothing too serious. He said he turned on his headphones and leaned the seat back to try and relax, but then he felt thumping under his feet on the floorboard. He looked out into the parking lot and saw the girl crawling out from under the hood of the truck. She stood up, walked backward, still staring at him the whole time, then disappeared into the shadows behind the opposite parking lot awnings. He immediately peeled out of there and parked at the nearest gas station next door, staying there until my session was over. After that, I never went back to that client's home. This took place about 10 years ago in Manitou Springs, Colorado. At the time, I was staying on my friend's couch in her trailer, and the space was extremely limited. I was desperately trying to find a place of my own. That's when I met a guy who lived a few trailers down from her, and he mentioned he was looking to rent out part of his trailer. So I went to check it out. From the moment I met him, something about him felt off in a creepy way. But I was so eager to get out of my friend's living room that I figured I would give anything a shot. When I went over to his place, he offered me a small space inside his tiny trailer or a cubby underneath it. The space under the trailer was about a 10 by 10 crawl space. Right then, I should have known something was wrong. But, like I said, I was desperate, and this was just the beginning of the strange things I'd experience. I reluctantly agreed to rent the small space inside the trailer and moved my stuff over that night. Almost immediately, he started talking about some curfew I had to follow if I was going to stay there, along with a bunch of other ridiculous rules. I wasn't having any of it, so I left. When I came back, I found him sprawled out on his front porch, mumbling about how he'd taken a bunch of pills and holding a half-empty bottle of booze. I had to step over him to get inside, and he started yelling at me about how I didn't follow his curfew. That's when I snapped and told him that if I was paying rent, I would come and go as I pleased. I was an adult, not his child. That set him off. He went into a full rage, and I was sure this was never going to work out. He got up, started throwing all my stuff out onto the street, and this was happening around 2 a.m. I grabbed what was left of my things, took them outside, and went around picking up the stuff he had already thrown out. I then went to my friend, begging her to let me back into her trailer. Luckily, she agreed. But the weirdness didn't stop there. A few days later, I saw a young girl at his place, and they were both drinking. I didn't think much of it at the time. About a week after that, once I had found another place to stay, my friend called me, panicking. She asked if I was okay, and after I calmed her down, I asked why she was so concerned. She told me that the police had just pulled a human body from the cubby under the guy's trailer, and it had been there for several days. Apparently, the guy had been arrested for attempting to rob a convenience store with a machete, and the girl's body had begun to smell. The landlord called the police, and they found her hand wrapped in a quilt under his trailer. As my friend was telling me this, all I could think about was how that could have been me if I hadn't left when I did. I never set foot in that trailer park again. Just going near it made me feel sick. And even though I felt terrible for that young girl, I was just grateful I walked away with my life. This happened in the summer of 2008, about a month after school ended. I was excited to be home. Our family is huge, and at that time, there were 9 of us living under one roof. My parents, my 4 sisters, my 2 brothers, and me. I'm the youngest. As the evening began, my mother decided we should all watch the movie Scream. Unfortunately, my father had to work. We usually watched movies in the living room, but this time, my mother decided we would watch it in her room since she had a big bed that could fit us all. After grabbing snacks and food, we turned off the lights and settled in to watch the movie. About 20 minutes into the film, I noticed my mother whispering something in my oldest sister's ear. It was too dark for me to hear what they were saying, but I figured she was probably asking my sister to grab something from the kitchen. My sister rolled her eyes and went downstairs. I focused back on the movie, but then I began to hear an unfamiliar voice coming from downstairs. Everyone else was so absorbed in the film that no one seemed to notice, but I could still hear it over the TV's volume. If you walked through my mother's bedroom door, you'd see the staircase to the left. I noticed a faint light flicker on the banister leading downstairs, but it quickly disappeared. Then I heard the front door close. No one else seemed to notice. Not long after, my sister returned upstairs with a bag tucked behind her back. She handed it to my mother and sat back on the bed. I was confused but chose not to say anything. After the movie finished, my mother announced it was bedtime. My siblings and I groaned in protest before heading to our rooms. Before I could leave, my mother asked me to throw away the empty popcorn bags. I didn't mind, but I had a deep fear of going downstairs alone, especially at night. Though I hesitated, I collected the trash and made my way to the kitchen. The only light left on downstairs was the cooktop light above the stove. As I passed through the dining room and into the kitchen, I paused when I saw something strange. On the fridge, I saw a shadow that looked like a man wearing a wide-brimmed hat and with a slightly pointy nose. He resembled the monster from Jeepers Creepers, though it was only a shadow. The figure stood silently, and I just froze, unable to move. I couldn't tell if it was some kitchen appliance or item casting the shadow, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I was paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, the shadow vanished, and I heard footsteps running out the back door through the pantry. I screamed, and my family rushed downstairs. My mother comforted me and asked what had happened. When I explained, I saw the realization hit her. Earlier that evening, she had given my oldest sister money to deliver to a drug dealer in exchange for weed. When I described the man, my mother confirmed it was the same person. She had known the dealer for years and was shocked to find out he had snuck back into the house to steal from us. Shelves and drawers had been opened, and items were scattered on the floor. Apparently, the front door had been left unlocked. My mother made us promise never to tell our father about what had happened that night. I've kept that promise ever since. Growing up, I lived with my mom in a small house. During my middle and high school years, she worked an overnight shift, so I spent most nights alone from about 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. This particular incident happened a few months before I graduated high school. On a normal night, I said goodbye to my mom around 7:30 and then played video games for a few hours. It was a school night, so I couldn't stay up too late, but I stayed up later than I should have. Around 11:30, I turned everything off and went to my room to get in bed. I ended up scrolling on my phone for probably another hour before I finally fell asleep. When I woke up, I thought I heard a door close downstairs. I glanced at the clock beside my bed and saw it was 3:30. I figured my mom had just come home from work earlier than expected. I turned over and tried to go back to sleep while listening to footsteps moving around downstairs. After a minute, though, I started to pay closer attention. Normally, my mom would head straight upstairs to get ready for bed when she got home, but it sounded like she was just wandering around. I kept listening for another 2 or 3 minutes and realized that the footsteps weren't stopping. They were moving through every room of the house, as if someone were slowly touring the place. A sense of unease started to grow, and I began to wonder if it was really my mom down there. I got up and switched on the light in my room, and almost immediately, the footsteps stopped. I strained to listen from the other side of my door, but there was complete silence. I carefully opened the door and looked into the hallway. I expected to see light coming from downstairs, but everything was dark. Whoever was walking around hadn't turned on any of the lights, which made my heart race even more. I tried to stay as quiet as possible, creeping further down the hallway until I reached the top of the stairs. I knelt down and peeked through the railing to get a view of the living room. There was nobody there, and even in the darkness, I could tell nothing had been disturbed. My PlayStation was still in the same spot, which made me feel slightly relieved. If someone had come to rob the house and had gone through all the rooms, they would have taken the most expensive item in the room. At that point, I was just desperate to figure out if it was my mom wandering around or if something stranger was happening, like I was having some kind of weird auditory hallucinations. I walked down the steps to the bottom and called out, "Mom, you home?" There was no response or signs of movement in the whole house, so I walked through the hallway into the kitchen. Right away, I saw a shoe print on the tile floors, and when I looked up, my eyes locked on a figure. Across the room, a man was sitting at the dining table with a dark mask on. His clothing was all black, which made it difficult to fully make out any features of him. He was looking at me, but he didn't say anything or even move. He stared at me with an emotionless look. I ran straight back upstairs and locked myself in my room as I called 911. The operator kept me updated on the police's estimated arrival, but after a minute, I heard the man slowly walk across the downstairs and over to the bottom of the staircase. I was whispering to the operator in a panic until I heard the front door open and the man walking away from the house. Not even 30 seconds later, I saw headlights shining through the window. My mom pulled into the driveway and I ran outside to meet her and tell her what was going on. When police got there, they did a thorough search and found nothing incriminating that would help us find the man. But from what it seems, the man wasn't there to rob us. He also didn't seem to have any interest in me either, which means that he was most likely trying to hurt or abduct my mom. It would then make sense why he broke in only minutes before my mom usually gets home. It makes me think about what could have happened if I hadn't gone downstairs to see who was there, or if my mom had gotten home just a minute earlier and gone inside unknowing of the man that was waiting for her. In my line of work, I've heard all the horror stories about crazy cults, people getting paid for weird requests, and so on. I never thought, with my luck, that I'd end up being a part of one of these stories. But I was wrong. This is probably going to turn into a mini-series since it's a bit long. For some context, I'm an introverted person. I don't go out much unless it's with my small group of friends. I started doing OnlyFans around the time when it became really popular during quarantine. Prior to that, I had been on FetLife, which is like Facebook but for kink communities. So when I thought about joining OnlyFans, it seemed like a natural progression, especially considering my work at an adult store and my time spent on FetLife. Normally, I don't accept friend requests unless I know the person in real life, due to some past issues with online encounters. I've gotten pretty good at sensing when something feels off, especially if I'm in danger. But this time, the danger was silent, and I wasn't prepared for it. I started posting regular content on my OnlyFans and was advised to create a Twitter for my fanbase, which made sense at the time. I was still pretty new to the idea. One day, while checking my messages on FetLife, I received a friend request with a message attached. It read, "Thank you, my name, for taking the time to read my message. I'll call myself Wolfie. I'm excited to help you with your OnlyFans because I see you have potential, and I can help. Please feel free to message me if you're interested in working together. Wolfie." The message struck me as overly formal, and the tagline, something about "join us," felt a little off. It's been a few months, so the exact details are a bit fuzzy, but I mainly wanted to block out as much of it as I could. I looked at his profile to see if there was any reason not to add him. I noticed he was in a pack with several other women of different age groups, and we all had OnlyFans and modeling in common. That wasn't alarming to me at first, so I decided to add him back. That's when the introduction to the cult began. Soon after, I started getting more messages from him and the others, saying how they could help me because I was now part of the pack. At the time, I thought it was just friendly interaction. Something in the back of my mind told me to be cautious, but, as they say, stupidity blinds you, and I ignored it. Looking back now, I wish I had trusted my gut. While I was at work, Wolfie would flood my inbox, saying he had added me to a special group on Twitter, where all of our pages were linked. He explained that we had to do a chain off if one of the girls posted about her OnlyFans. We had to share it and keep the pack happy, which seemed harmless in my mind. That became an every hour a new post was made and we had to share and do the same in return for hours. I thought this was normal for Twitter because I hardly ever use it. I was put in two chats. The main chat and the one with just Wolfie and his wife because she wanted to see if I was a good match for their pack. He would often send me photos of them in bed and say things like, "One day you'll be in the middle of us where you belong." Mind you, I am in a relationship with my partner of 8 years at this point, so I wasn't sure if he was just kidding or not. He would send me messages of him telling me how to post my pages, my photos, and anytime I had updated my FetLife with new modeling photos, he was the first to comment, "This is my cub. Appreciate her or I'll end you." Things of that nature. I get the whole being alpha thing, but it was just getting creepy to me that just seconds after my post went live, it was already getting attention. To my knowledge, there isn't a way to get notifications of someone's post on that specific site like Twitter unless he had my page open. Waiting. I started to feel more strange vibes when he started sending me messages via his wife and her telling me someday we were all going to get a place in the middle of nowhere. No one would find us and we'd all do this work together and live together in this wolf alpha-based lifestyle, which sounds like a cult now that I'm actually writing this. There were 4 other girls that were all doing the same thing, listening and doing everything their alpha said. A few days went by and Wolfie started making me feel really uncomfortable. He posted a writing of his own on his page and made sure to tell me in the group that I was his favorite new little cub and that this was for my own good. The writing was about how he loved me and told me to be in his outfit and wait for him in my room for him. He snuck into my apartment and attacked my partner, beat him close to death, and brought him up into my room. He wrote I had to choose who I loved more. He wrote I chose him over my partner and that he then dominated me and killed my partner and I was stolen away to live with him in his pack forever. My stomach had dropped out of my body as I reread the story he made up. The details of my apartment he couldn't possibly know. The things about my home nobody knew unless they were in my home scared me. I was on edge for days because I didn't have a clue how he knew these details. My skin was crawling. I told him I didn't know how I felt of this story, that he fantasized about me and his world. I knew that this was the reason I had to run. Wolfie kept showing the rest of his pack the story and had me under his list of relationships as his submissive and in a poly relationship with me and his wife. My skin for days was crawling with the fear of me not knowing how he knew all the things he knew. I never posted about my home. He saw a post of me in a bad mood from a disagreement, but that obviously couldn't because he just wrote some really messed up fantasy murder about me, was it? The rest of the week, I wore oversized clothes and cried on and off because I was terrified to be alone in my apartment. I showed my partner and friend, and they both agreed that this was not something I would be able to handle on my own. I took myself out of the groups on Twitter for a start and tried not to draw attention to Wolfie when the girls started messaging me out of the blue saying they didn't understand why I wanted to be brainwashed by my partner, and they loved me and everything would be fine if I went with them. I deleted my Twitter and also my OnlyFans because I didn't know what they could find on me. I blocked them all on all my new accounts, and I also took down my profile in FetLife and made a new one with a completely different name and credentials so they couldn't find me. I even changed my number because Wolfie found out what it was to try and get me to talk to him and explain while I was pulling away. I made new accounts and made sure everyone was aware that needed to know about this potential stalker so I could maintain my sanity. I thought it was over when a week had passed and I didn't see any new messages on my new profile in FetLife or my messages. But boy, was I wrong. My best friend had checked her messages on Instagram where, of course, he found me via her. He asked if she knew where I was and if I was okay because I disappeared out of nowhere. I thought I had escaped the nightmare. I went on to my Instagram I had made and had a few different messages from him about him coming to get to rescue and save me. I was terrified about how far this guy would go to get to me. Why couldn't he just leave me alone? I blocked him again in countless times of changing my names and such. I had finally reached a point of just getting into the habit of bringing my knife to work in my boots and blocking my deadbolt when I was alone because I didn't want to be afraid anymore. This was almost a month of me being terrified out of my mind. I made one last post to my FetLife about him so all my following could see that I was in actual danger. And I was done being afraid and openly said that if they were wanting to come for me, I'd be ready with law enforcement and such. And thankfully after that post was made public, I went to check his profile to see if it was still up and it was gone. It's been a few months since this had happened and thank God, I haven't had any weird messages or my friends getting anything weird from this whole thing. I wish I would have listened to my intuition about this in the first place. Maybe then it could have all been avoided. Thankfully, I am safe from this insane wolf pack cult. The first drop of blood on the forest floor stopped us dead in our tracks. It was vivid against the dark earth, a stark reminder that we were no longer alone in these woods. What had started as a leisurely hike had suddenly taken a far darker turn. The weight of our discovery hung heavy in the air between us. I'd known Jake and Sarah since college, and we'd made it a tradition to go on an annual camping trip together. This year, we'd chosen a remote trail in the Adirondacks, eager to escape the chaos of city life and reconnect with nature. The first 2 days had been perfect: crisp mountain air, stunning vistas, and the kind of easy camaraderie that comes from years of friendship. But on the third day, everything changed. We'd veered off the main trail, following a barely visible path that promised a shortcut to a secluded waterfall. That's when Sarah spotted it. A single, perfectly round drop of blood on a fallen leaf. "Guys," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look at this." Jake and I crowded around, peering at the leaf. "It's probably just from an animal," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Maybe a deer that got scratched by a branch." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The blood was fresh, still glistening in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the canopy above. Jake knelt down, examining the ground around the leaf. "There's more," he said, pointing to a faint trail of droplets leading deeper into the forest. "Looks like whatever it is, it's heading that way." We exchanged uneasy glances. The smart thing to do would be to turn back, to pretend we hadn't seen anything and continue on our planned route. But curiosity, that fatal human flaw, got the better of us. "We should check it out," Sarah said, her eyes bright with a mix of fear and excitement. "What if someone's hurt and needs help?" I wanted to argue, to point out all the reasons why following a mysterious blood trail in the middle of nowhere was a terrible idea. But I could see the determination in Sarah's face, and I knew Jake would side with her. So, against my better judgment, I nodded. We followed the trail of blood, moving as quietly as we could through the underbrush. The drops became more frequent, larger, forming a clear path through the forest. The air felt heavier somehow, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. After about 10 minutes of walking, we came to a small clearing. What we saw there made my blood run cold. In the center of the clearing was a deer carcass, freshly killed and partially butchered. But this wasn't a typical hunter's kill. The animal had been arranged in a deliberate pattern, its limbs splayed out in unnatural angles. Around it, drawn in what could only be the deer's blood, were strange symbols I didn't recognize. "What the hell?" Jake breathed, his face pale. Sarah had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "We need to go," she whispered now. But before we could move, a twig snapped somewhere behind us. We whirled around, hearts pounding, to see a figure step out from behind a tree. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with wild eyes and matted hair. He was dressed in tattered clothes that might once have been hunting gear, and in his hand, he held a wicked-looking knife, its blade dark with blood. Well, he said, his voice a raspy growl. "Looks like we've got some uninvited guests." I felt Sarah grip my arm, her fingers digging in painfully. Jake had shifted into a defensive stance, placing himself between us and the stranger. "We're sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We didn't mean to intrude. We'll just be on our way." The man's face split into a grin, revealing yellow teeth. "Oh, I don't think so. You've seen too much now. Can't have you running off and telling tales. Can we?" As he spoke, more figures emerged from the trees around us. 3, 4, 5 of them, all with the same wild look, all armed. We were surrounded, but what followed was a nightmare of fear and desperation. We ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. All that mattered was getting away from those men and their mad rituals. I could hear them behind us, their shouts and the crashing of their pursuits spurring us on. My lungs burned, and branches whipped at my face, but I didn't dare slow down. We burst out of the tree line onto a rocky outcropping overlooking a steep ravine. The drop was easily 100 feet with a rushing river at the bottom. We skidded to a halt at the edge, trapped between the cliff and our pursuers. "What do we do?" Sarah gasped, her eyes wild with panic. Jake was looking frantically around, searching for an escape route. "We can't go back," he said. "They'll catch us for sure." I peered over the edge of the cliff, my stomach lurching at the dizzying drop. "We can't jump either. It's too far." The sounds of pursuit were getting closer. We had seconds at most before they would be upon us. That's when I spotted it. A narrow ledge running along the cliff face, just wide enough for a person to edge along. It disappeared around a bend in the rock, potentially leading to a way down. "There," I said, pointing. "It's our only chance." Sarah looked at the ledge, then back at the forest, where we could now see movement among the trees. "Are you insane? We'll fall." "We don't have a choice," Jake said grimly. "It's that or face those maniacs." With no time left to argue, we began to edge our way along the ledge. The rock was slick with spray from the river below, making each step treacherous. I went first, then Sarah, with Jake bringing up the rear. We had made it about halfway around the bend when our pursuers burst out of the forest. Their shouts of anger turned to howls of frustration when they saw us on the ledge. "Keep going." I called back to the others, "Don't stop. Don't look down." But even as I said it, I heard a scream. Sarah had slipped, her foot skidding on the wet rock. She teetered on the edge for a heart-stopping moment before Jake grabbed her, hauling her back against the cliff face. The men on the cliff top were getting bolder. One of them had produced a rifle and was taking aim. The crack of gunfire echoed off the rocks, and chips of stone exploded inches from my head. "Move," Jake yelled, pushing Sarah ahead of him. "Go, go, go." We scrambled along the ledge, bullets pinging off the rock around us. Just when I thought we couldn't go any further, the ledge widened, revealing a narrow path leading down the cliff face. We half ran, half slid down the path, loose rocks skittering away under our feet. The shouts from above grew fainter as we descended, and finally, mercifully, we reached the bottom of the ravine. Without pausing to catch our breath, we plunged into the icy river. The current was strong, threatening to sweep us away, but we fought against it, struggling towards the far bank. By the time we dragged ourselves out of the water on the other side, there was no sign of our pursuers. We collapsed on the rocky shore, gasping for air, our bodies shaking with cold and adrenaline. "Do you think we lost them?" Sarah asked between chattering teeth. Jake nodded, scanning the clifftop. "I think so. No way they could follow us down here." As the immediate danger passed, the reality of our situation began to sink in. We were miles from our campsite, soaking wet, with no supplies and no idea where we were. And somewhere out there, a group of murderous cultists was probably still looking for us. "We need to find help," I said, struggling to my feet. "A ranger station, a town, anything." We set off along the riverbank, exhausted but driven by the need to put as much distance between us and that clearing as possible. It was nearly dark by the time we stumbled upon a road, and another hour before a passing truck stopped to help us. The local police were skeptical of our story, but a search of the area where we'd been camping turned up evidence that corroborated our account. They found the remains of several animals arranged in ritualistic patterns, along with signs of a long-term camp hidden deep in the woods. But of the men who had chased us, there was no sign. They had vanished back into the forest, leaving behind only the chilling memory of their mad eyes and bloody knives. We never went camping again after that. The experience left us changed, more aware of the darkness that can lurk in the wilderness and in the hearts of men. Sometimes, late at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of those inhuman howls ringing in my ears, and I wonder about those men, what drove them to such madness, and whether they're still out there, waiting for their next unsuspecting victims to stumble upon their unholy rituals. The forest holds many secrets, some beautiful, some terrifying. We were lucky to escape with our lives, but the scars of that day will stay with us forever. It's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators in the wilderness walk on two legs. The mansion towered in front of me, a towering mass of stone and darkness as the last light of day faded. As I fumbled with the keys, an eerie sensation crawled up my spine, far beyond the chill of the crisp autumn evening. I reassured myself that it was simply nerves. After all, it's not every day someone asks you to house sit for a vast estate that looks like it was plucked from the pages of a Gothic novel. I pushed the heavy oak door open, wincing as it groaned loudly, its sound echoing through the expansive entry. "Hello," I called out, my voice feeling small and distant in the grand space. The silence that followed was only interrupted by the steady ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. "Get a grip, Sarah," I muttered under my breath. "You're here alone, just like Mrs. Blackwood said. No need to be afraid of shadows." I hauled my suitcase up the grand staircase, the soft padding of my steps muffled by the luxurious carpet. The room Mrs. Blackwood had assigned to me was enormous, larger than my entire apartment, with a four-poster bed that seemed to have enough space for an army. I quickly unpacked, eager to explore the rest of the mansion before night fully descended. Each new room I found felt even grander than the last. A library with towering bookshelves filled with ancient volumes, a music room housing a dusty grand piano, a sunroom bursting with exotic plants I couldn't name. It was like stepping into a forgotten era, one of wealth and faded opulence. As the sun dipped, I retreated to the kitchen to prepare some dinner. The modern appliances clashed with the old-fashioned surroundings, a jarring reminder of the present. I ate my meal in silence, the scrape of my fork against the plate sounding unusually loud in the otherwise quiet house. That first night was restless. The house groaned and creaked as it settled, in ways my apartment never had. Every little noise made me jolt awake, heart racing, before I reminded myself where I was. By the time morning came, I was more drained than when I had gone to bed. The next day passed without incident. I worked remotely from the library, the Wi-Fi surprisingly strong for a house of its age. As evening drew near, I decided to unwind with a bath in the clawfoot tub, hoping the warm water would ease my tension. I had just settled into the soothing steam when I heard it, a thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. My blood went cold. I held my breath, straining to listen. There it was again, the slow, deliberate tread of someone trying to move quietly. It's just the house settling, I told myself, or your imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew better. With shaking hands, I got out of the tub and dressed quickly. I crept to the bathroom door and pressed my ear against it. The footsteps had stopped, but now I could hear something else, the sound of drawers opening and closing. Someone was in the house, searching for something. Panic clawed at my throat. My phone was in the bedroom. The landline was downstairs. I was trapped. Think of Sarah. Think. I looked around the bathroom, desperate for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on a heavy crystal soap dish. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Taking a deep breath, I eased the bathroom door open. The hallway was empty, but I could hear movement coming from one of the spare bedrooms. As quietly as I could, I crept towards the stairs. I had just reached the top of the staircase when a floorboard creaked beneath my foot. The noise from the bedroom stopped abruptly. Heart pounding, I flew down the stairs, taking them two at a time. I could hear heavy footsteps behind me, giving chase. I ran for the front door only to find it locked. In my panic, I couldn't remember which key was which. A hand grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. I lashed out blindly with the soap dish, feeling it connect with something solid. There was a grunt of pain and the grip on my shoulder loosened. I didn't wait to see who my attacker was. I ran for the kitchen, thinking of the back door behind me. I could hear the intruder recovering, their footsteps pounding after me. The kitchen was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the microwave clock. I stumbled through it, hands outstretched, searching for the door. My hips slammed into the kitchen island, and I bit back a cry of pain. Where was the damn door? My fingers brushed against cool glass. The door. I fumbled for the handle, my sweaty hand slipping on the smooth metal. Got it. I yanked the door open and burst out into the cool night air. The vast manicured lawn stretched out before me. The trees at its edge, a dark, forbidding wall. I ran towards them, the damp grass soaking through my socks. I had just reached the tree line when I heard the back door slam open. Stop, a deep voice bellowed. The sound spurred me on, pushing me deeper into the woods. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond get away, get help. I don't know how long I ran. Could have been minutes or hours. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. But fear kept me going, the certainty that if I stopped, something terrible would happen. Finally, when I felt I couldn't take another step, I saw lights through the trees. A house. I stumbled towards it, relief making me dizzy. As I broke through the tree line, I realized with a start that I recognized this house. It was the mansion. Somehow, in my blind panic, I had run in a circle. For a moment, I stood frozen, unsure what to do. Then I saw a car in the driveway that hadn't been there before. A police car. Safety. I ran towards it, waving my arms. Help, I screamed. Oh, please help me. The front door of the mansion opened and a police officer stepped out, followed by Mrs. Blackwood. Oh, thank God, Mrs. Blackwood said, rushing towards me. Sarah, dear, are you all right? We've been so worried. I stared at her, uncomprehending. There's someone in the house, I managed to gasp out. An intruder, he chased me. Mrs. Blackwood and the officer exchanged a look. Sarah, Mrs. Blackwood said gently, there's no intruder. It's just Harold. Harold. As if summoned by his name, a man appeared in the doorway. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and a kindly face. There was a bruise forming on his cheek. I'm so sorry for frightening you, he said, his voice deep and apologetic. The same voice that had shouted after me in the woods. I should have announced myself. Sarah, this is my husband, Harold, Mrs. Blackwood explained. He wasn't supposed to be back until next week, but his business trip ended early. He came home to surprise me, not realizing I had asked you to house sit. The adrenaline that had been keeping me going suddenly evaporated, leaving me light-headed. But the noises, the searching Harold looked sheepish. I was searching for my reading glasses, careful not to wake you, so I tried to move as quietly as possible. When I heard you run, I attempted to explain myself, but he only pointed to his bruised cheek. You've got quite an arm, he remarked. I felt heat rush to my face, mortified. I'm so sorry, I stammered. I didn't know. No, it's entirely my fault. Harold insisted, saying I should have called or at least turned on some lights. Mrs. Blackwood wrapped an arm around my shoulders. Come inside, dear. You're trembling like a leaf. We'll get you warmed up, and we'll sort all of this out. As we made our way back to the house with the police officer trailing behind, I couldn't help but laugh. After all that fear, all that running, and it turned out to be just a misunderstanding. But later that night, as I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the Blackwoods moving about the house, a small part of me wondered, what if it hadn't been Harold? What if it had been a real intruder? I pulled the blankets up higher, suddenly aware of how vast and empty the mansion felt, and how many hiding places there were for someone, or something, to conceal itself. Sleep didn't come easily that night. In that fleeting moment, I saw John and Martha for what they really were. Not living people, but shadows, empty silhouettes where real people should have been. When my vision returned to normal, they were gone. The house around me seemed to flicker and distort, like a mirage in the desert. I blinked, and suddenly, I was back in my car, still parked on that dirt road where I had first spotted the farmhouse. The rain had stopped. Dawn was breaking, the first light of day creeping through the trees. My hands trembled as I started the engine and slowly reversed, returning to the main road. As I drove towards Millbrook, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something awful. But what had happened in that house? Was it a dream? A hallucination caused by the storm and exhaustion? I'll never know for sure. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone on rainy nights, I catch a glimpse of a farmhouse in my rearview mirror, its windows glowing with warm light. I speed up, never looking back, always pushing forward. Because now I understand. Some shortcuts are best avoided, and some storms are best faced alone. The first sign of trouble came with the sputtering of my car's engine, a noise that sent an icy shiver down my spine as I drove along that desolate stretch of highway. When the car lurched to a stop, I had no idea that this breakdown would mark the beginning of a terrifying encounter, one that would push me to my limits. Sometimes the most horrifying monsters aren't the ones in our nightmares, but the ones that look like helpful strangers. My name's Emily, and I've always prided myself on being independent and resourceful. But that night, those qualities would be tested like never before. I was on my way home from a job interview, feeling optimistic about the meeting. It had been a long drive, but I was riding the high of what I thought was a successful interview. The sun had set hours ago, and the highway had emptied, leaving only the occasional truck passing by. I was tired but determined to get home. Then, without warning, my trusty old sedan decided to quit. The engine made a terrible grinding sound, and despite my desperate attempts, the car rolled to a stop along the shoulder of the road. No, 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 I muttered as I turned the key in the ignition again and again. Nothing, not even a sputter. I sat there for a moment, trying to steady my racing heart. I was in the middle of nowhere, my phone showing no signal. The moonless night seemed to swallow me whole, the darkness beyond my headlights pitch black. Taking a deep breath, I opened the hood and stepped out of the car. I didn't know much about engines, but I hoped it might be something simple, something I could fix. But as soon as I lifted the hood, I knew it was hopeless. The engine was a confusing tangle of pipes and wires that meant nothing to me. Just as I was about to close the hood, I saw headlights approaching in the distance. Relief flooded through me. Maybe they would stop and help, or at least let me use their phone. The vehicle, an old pickup truck, slowed as it neared me, pulled over, and a man got out. In the glow of my headlights, I could see he was middle-aged with a weathered face and calloused hands. He wore worn jeans and a flannel shirt, looking every bit the part of a local farmer or rancher. "Car trouble," he called out, walking towards me. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. "It just died on me. I don't suppose you know anything about engines?" He chuckled. "I might know a thing or two. Mind if I take a look?" I stepped aside, allowing him to peer into the engine compartment. He poked around for a few minutes, making thoughtful noises. "Well, looks like your timing belt's shot," he finally said. "Not something we can fix out here, I'm afraid." My heart sank. "I don't suppose you have a cell phone I could borrow?" "Mine's not getting any service out here." He shook his head. "Sorry, don't believe in those things. But tell you what, I can give you a ride to the nearest town. There's a mechanic there who could help you out." I hesitated. Every instinct was screaming at me not to get into a car with a stranger, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. But what choice did I have? I couldn't stay here all night, and who knew when another car might come along. "That would be great. Thank you," I heard myself say. He smiled, but something about it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Happy to help. Name's Tom, by the way." "Emily," I replied, grabbing my purse from my car. As we drove, Tom kept up a steady stream of small talk. He asked about where I was from, where I was headed. I answered vaguely, not wanting to give away too much information. Something about him was making me increasingly uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on why. We had been driving for about 20 minutes when I realized something was wrong. We should have reached a town by now, or at least seen some signs of civilization, but there was nothing but darkness outside the windows. "How much further is it to town?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Tom glanced at me, and this time, there was no mistaking the coldness in his eyes. "Oh, we're not going to town, Emily." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean? Where are we going?" He didn't answer, just pressed down harder on the accelerator. The truck picked up speed, eating up the empty road ahead. Panic surged through me. I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Child locks, I realized with horror. "Please," I said, my voice shaking. "Just let me out. I won't tell anyone. I swear." Tom laughed, a harsh sound that made my skin crawl. "Oh, I know you won't tell anyone. No one ever does." The implication of his words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't the first time he had done this. How many other stranded motorists had he picked up, promising help only to? I couldn't even finish the thought. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. I could try to grab the wheel, force us off the road. But at this speed, that would likely kill us both. I could try to reason with him, appeal to his humanity. But the cold gleam in his eyes told me that was a lost cause. As we sped through the night, Tom started talking again. But this time, his words chilled me to the bone. "You know, Emily, you really shouldn't trust strangers," he said, his tone conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. "Bad things happen to girls who aren't careful. But don't worry, it'll all be over soon." I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I forced them back. I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Suddenly, an idea struck me. It was risky, potentially fatal, but it was the only chance I had. I started coughing violently, doubling over in my seat. "What the hell?" Tom said, glancing over at me. I continued coughing, making choking noises. "Can't breathe," I gasped out. Tom looked uncertain for the first time. "Hey, cut that out," he said, but I could hear a note of concern in his voice. I slumped in my seat, my coughs turning to wheezes. I closed my eyes, letting my body go limp. "Shit," Tom muttered. The truck began to slow down. I felt the vehicle pull over to the side of the road. Tom put it in park and leaned over me. "Hey, wake up," he said, shaking my shoulder roughly. This was my chance. My eyes snapped open, and I drove my elbow into his face with all the strength I could muster. I felt his nose crunch under the impact, and he reeled back with a howl of pain. In his moment of distraction, I lunged for the keys in the ignition. I yanked them out and scrambled for the door, my fingers scrabbling at the lock. Tom recovered quickly, grabbing for me. His fingers tangled in my hair, yanking me back. I screamed, more in rage than fear, and twisted in his grip. My free hand found his eyes, and I dug my fingers in without mercy. He let go with a scream of agony, and I tumbled out of the truck onto the hard ground. Pain shot through my body, but adrenaline kept me moving. I staggered to my feet and ran. I could hear Tom behind me, cursing and stumbling in the darkness. But I had the advantage now. My eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and I was younger, faster. I ran like I had never run before, my lungs burning, my legs pumping. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. The keys were still clutched in my hand, cutting into my palm. I don't know how long I ran. Could have been minutes or hours. Eventually, I couldn't hear Tom anymore, but I didn't slow down. The night was alive with noises. The rustle of wind through grass, the hoot of an owl, the scurrying of small animals. But to my terrified mind, every sound was Tom coming to finish what he had started. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it. Lights in the distance. A town, or at least a gas station. Civilization. Safety. With a final burst of energy I didn't know I possessed, I sprinted towards the lights. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of a small gas station, a lone beacon in the darkness. I burst into the fluorescent-lit store, startling the sleepy-looking clerk behind the counter. "Please," I gasped out. "Call the police. There's a man." He tried to. I couldn't finish the sentence. The adrenaline that had kept me going suddenly drained away, leaving me shaky and weak. My legs buckled, and I collapsed to the floor, the weight of the night's events finally catching up with me. The clerk, to his credit, didn't hesitate. He grabbed the phone and dialed 911 while keeping a nervous watch on the door. The police arrived swiftly, their flashing lights a beacon of relief. I recounted everything, describing Tom and his truck with as much detail as I could recall. They found him a few hours later, attempting to fix his truck on the side of the road. The keys I had taken were the only set he had. Inside his truck, they uncovered evidence connecting him to several unsolved disappearances in the area. As for me, I was fortunate. Aside from some cuts and bruises, I was physically unharmed. But the mental scars took much longer to fade. For months afterward, I couldn't drive at night without breaking into a cold sweat. Every truck that passed me on the highway sent my heart racing, but I made it through. I outsmarted a predator and lived to share my story. If my experience can serve as a warning, urging others to trust their instincts and be cautious, then maybe something good can come from that terrifying night. I still drive that stretch of highway now and then, and every time I pass the spot where my car broke down, I silently thank whatever force was watching over me that night and the strength I discovered within myself when I needed it the most. It was New Year's Eve, 1994. I was a senior in high school, and every weekend my friends and I would hop from one party to the next. That night, we were rushing to get to a keg party before all the beer was gone. We had already been drinking for hours, having found a homeless man who agreed to buy us a case of beer. This was our usual method of getting alcohol, finding some guy on the street who was happy to get a free drink for himself. The case was nearly finished, and we were all eager to keep the buzz going. With only about an hour left before midnight, we were still a couple of miles away from the party. My friend, who was driving, decided to take a shortcut through the downtown area of our city. Downtown was typically quiet at this time of night, and this night was no different. We were stopped at a red light a few blocks away from another, where a Mustang and a motorcycle were also waiting for the light to change. When our light turned green, their light did too, and we could see that the two vehicles were racing toward the next light, about 100 yards away. They started out neck and neck, but the motorcycle quickly pulled ahead. To show off, the rider on the bike popped a wheelie while maintaining his lead. I wasn't impressed by the spectacle, but we slowed down and hung back to watch. The motorcycle was about 3 car lengths ahead when the rider brought the bike back down onto 2 wheels but lost control shortly after. The bike swerved left, directly into the path of the Mustang. The driver of the Mustang had no time to react and collided with the motorcycle, rolling over it and its rider. From what I could tell, the car was probably going around 85 miles per hour at the moment of impact. My friends slammed on the brakes, and we watched as the rider was thrown from the back of the car. Miraculously, the motorcycle flew over the hood of the car and crashed through the windshield. Both drivers likely died instantly. The Mustang began to slow down and came to a stop against the curb on the left side of the street. No one in the car said a word. We were all stunned, just staring at the scene, hoping someone would move. But nothing happened. After sitting in silence for several minutes, I quietly leaned forward in my seat and told my friend to take me home. He didn't speak or face me. He simply put the car into gear and made a right turn. What happened after I was dropped off, I don't know. I can say for myself, witnessing that caused a large shift in the way I live my life from then on. Some people may ask why we didn't try to render aid to those 2 men. They do have a good argument, but I can only say that I personally was far too freaked out to help anyone. Because of this, I wanted to be anywhere other than there with those 2 people. When my friends and I spoke about the incident a few days later, it never entered the conversation. It was all just a given in our minds that they were both dead. According to the news the following day, our assumptions were correct. Both men had died instantly. The driver of the Mustang, a 19-year-old kid, was almost beheaded by the impact of the motorcycle. That night marked the end of my careless drinking and partying. After we returned to school, I began focusing on my schoolwork and impending graduation. A couple of the other guys carried on as usual, and their lives ended in varying levels of disappointment and loss. Focusing on my future paid off greatly, and that was only because of how I altered the way I was living my life and my priorities. In spite of the tragedy that occurred that night, it showed me in clear detail how living your life in such a reckless way could end so badly. Continue on the path I was on, I feel really would have meant those young men lost their lives for nothing, and that is truly the tragedy. My first year of college marked the beginning of my life outside of my hometown. I had always been a bit shy, but being away from home and surrounded by unfamiliar faces made me even more reserved. I made a few friends in my dorm, just 1 or 2 girls who introduced themselves, and we became close. However, for months, they were the only people I interacted with. That all changed when I met Brian. He was also a freshman, and like me, he was pretty introverted. We clicked right away and were dating within a month. He was deeply into anime and Japanese culture, probably the biggest weeboo at the school. Despite that, he treated me well for a while. However, after about 6 months together, things began to shift. One day, we were chatting about our favorite movies when he realized none of mine were anime-related. He suddenly got really angry and started accusing me of lying. I was taken aback by his harsh reaction. He'd never behaved like this before. He started calling me a fake and a liar, claiming that I had tricked him into dating me. It made no sense to me. I had never once told him that I liked anime, and I think he just assumed I would, based on my Japanese heritage. Now, I realized that was probably why he even approached me in the first place. His outburst left me stunned, and I ran to my room to get away from it all. I didn't hear from him again until he sent me a text a few days later. In the message, he said he wanted to meet up and apologize in person, and, like a fool, I agreed. When I arrived at the library, however, his apology quickly turned into another shouting match. He started off calm but grew angrier and angrier as the conversation went on, and things escalated quickly. Once again, I retreated to my room and stayed there for weeks, only leaving for class. Luckily, I had forgotten to give him my class schedule. Over the next few weeks, I received numerous apologies from him, sometimes more than one in a day, but I had learned my lesson and ignored them all. Eventually, he figured out I wasn't going to reach out to him and began showing up at my dorm, trying to get to me. The other girls did a great job keeping him away, but eventually, he wouldn't take no for an answer. We had to call campus police to make him leave. That night, the other girls came to my room to express their concerns. They made it clear they were worried, not just for my safety, but for their own as well. They recommended I file a restraining order against him. So the next day, along with a few of the girls from the rugby team, I went to the campus police office to file the order. Since I occasionally ventured off of campus, the officer suggested I also go to the city police and file another order with them, and so I did. The seriousness of all this was becoming overwhelming. Without the support of my friends, I'm not sure I would have survived it at all. The following day, he must have been notified of my filings. I received almost 10 text messages from him running the gamut of sincere apologies to actual death threats. I emailed the messages to both the police agencies, and they said to keep in touch with them and to call 911 if he tried to contact me again in person. Me ignoring his messages must have bothered him so much that he was willing to risk jail because a couple of days later, he showed up at my dorm. He was likely headed for my room, but was spotted before he made it to my floor. The campus police caught him and eventually turned him over to the city police. After spending the night in jail, he was released. Later that afternoon, he was sent a message to report to the dean's office. The stalking and subsequent arrests had reached some of those higher up at the university, and they were brought into a meeting to hear his side. At the end of the hour-long meeting, it was decided to kick him out. He was told to be off the campus grounds by 9 p.m. that evening, and to my amazement, he did as he was told for once. That was the last time I saw him. Of course, he had to send me one more angry text message on his way out of town, but I was so happy that he was leaving. His words didn't bother me at all. The charges against him were eventually dropped. They were contingent upon him leaving town and never contacting me again. I'm overjoyed to say that he's kept his side of the bargain. My only remaining concerns are for the next poor girl he may set his sights on. Hopefully, he learned his lesson and there won't be a next time. It started with a feeling, an itch at the back of my mind, a prickling awareness that something was watching me. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the mind, a symptom of exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. I lived alone in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of an aging complex, the kind with thin walls and a perpetually flickering hallway light. At night, the creaks of the old building became a symphony of phantom footsteps and whispers. I had convinced myself that I was used to it, until the knocking started. First, it was soft. 3 short taps at my front door just past midnight. By the time I got up the nerve to check, the hallway was empty. The next night, it happened again. And the night after that. I stopped checking after the 4th night. If someone wanted my attention, they weren't going to get it. Not from me. Then the knocking moved to my window. It made no sense. My window overlooked the alley below, 3 stories up with no balcony, no fire escape. Nothing that would allow someone to reach it. But at exactly 12:03 a.m., the taps came. 3 of them. Steady. Deliberate. I didn't check. Couldn't. The next morning, I called my building's maintenance office. They checked the security footage from the night before. There was nothing. No movement. No one entering or leaving my floor. Just a grainy, silent film of me, sitting on my couch, staring at the window, waiting. That night, I hardly slept. I lay in bed, every muscle tense, ears straining for the sound. 12:03 a.m. 3 knocks. I held my breath, staring at the ceiling. The room felt heavy, the air thick. It was in the silence between each knock that I swore I heard something else. Breathing. The next day, I bought a thick blackout curtain for the window. I nailed it into place. No gaps, no light, no way to see in or out. But when the clock struck 12:03, the knocking came again. This time I heard my name. I didn't recognize the voice. It wasn't deep or raspy, not inhuman. It was soft, familiar, like someone I had once known but long forgotten. A memory from childhood, lost to time. Let me in. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the voice away, but it didn't stop. The knocking came again, louder this time. I grabbed my phone, my fingers shaking, and texted my neighbor across the hall. "Are you awake?" The response came almost instantly. Asterisk, "Yeah. You okay?" Asterisk. I hesitated, then typed, "Do you hear anything outside my door?" Pause. Then, asterisk, "No." "Why?" Asterisk. I bit my lip, gripping my phone so hard my knuckles turned white. The knocking was still there, the voice still calling, but my neighbor heard nothing. I turned on every light in my apartment, paced the floor until sunrise. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through the peephole, the hallway was empty. But something was off. The door across from mine, the one belonging to the neighbor I had texted, was wide open. I stared at the darkness beyond, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then my phone buzzed. Another message from my neighbor. Asterisk, "I don't know why you're texting me. I haven't been home all week." Asterisk. I turned back to my window, dread creeping through my veins. The blackout curtain had been pulled aside. 12:03 a.m. was only hours away, and this time I knew the knocking wouldn't stop. That night, I sat on my bed, staring at the window, watching the clock tick closer to the inevitable. My phone lay beside me, useless, the weight of reality pressing down on me. 12:02 a.m. My breathing was shallow, my muscles locked in place. A bead of sweat rolled down my temple. The air in the room felt electric, charged with something unseen, something waiting. 12:03 a.m. 3 knocks, sharp, purposeful. I closed my eyes. I wouldn't answer. I wouldn't move. Then the door handle rattled. I bit down on my lip to keep from making a sound. The knob twisted, slow and deliberate, but the deadbolt held firm. My heart pounded against my ribs, my lungs burning from holding my breath. A long, heavy silence stretched between us. Then, finally, I exhaled, my body sagging in relief. A voice whispered from the other side of the door. "You locked me out." It wasn't the same voice as before. This one was different, colder, less human. I clamped a hand over my mouth, forcing myself to stay silent. The thing on the other side of the door let out a low chuckle, its breath hissing through the gap beneath the doorframe. It lingered for what felt like an eternity before the footsteps finally retreated down the hall. I didn't sleep. I sat there, waiting for the sun to rise, waiting for proof that I had survived another night. When dawn finally broke, I dared to open the door. The hallway was empty. The neighbor's door, still wide open, revealed nothing but a vacant apartment. Dusty, abandoned, as if no one had lived there for years. Then I noticed something at my feet. A single, blackened fingerprint smudged against the threshold. I shut the door, locked it, and pressed my back against the wood. I wasn't alone. Not really. Regardless of what anyone believes about the paranormal, I can say with certainty that these two experiences are 100% true. I lived through them. I've always been open to the idea of the paranormal because how could anyone be completely sure that something doesn't exist? Even though I haven't encountered little gray men or Bigfoot, hundreds of people claim they have, and I think that has to count for something. That being said, I've always had a very practical and analytical mind. I watch ghost hunting shows, but with a healthy dose of skepticism, always questioning how certain things could have been faked. Many times, it's obvious that things are staged, but not always. A lot of things have happened to me that I first dismissed as coincidence, but these two experiences I can't dismiss. The first one took place at a famous seaside restaurant in California, a spot that's been featured on several ghost hunting shows and on Unsolved Mysteries. I lived about 30 minutes from there, but had never visited until one evening. I finally got the chance to go for dinner with my boyfriend. I was fascinated by the place, so I started asking the staff about their experiences with the infamous specter that supposedly haunted it. I was excited to have a paranormal encounter as long as I wasn't alone for it. At some point during the evening, I needed to use the restroom. I realized that the bathroom was outside the dining room, down a long, quiet hallway, so I asked my boyfriend to walk with me. He didn't want to wait right outside the women's room, so he stayed near the entrance to the hallway. That left me alone in the restroom. Of course, it was just my luck that no one else needed to use the bathroom. I went into the second of two stalls, did my thing, and suddenly, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was no sound, just an overwhelming feeling. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that the dark, quiet hallway had gotten to me, and I tried to shake it off. But I was relieved when, a minute later, someone else came in. She went into the other stall, and I came out of mine to wash my hands. That's when I noticed that the other stall door was wide open and clearly empty. There was no sign of the woman who had just entered. There was nowhere else she could have gone in the small restroom. Yet, I had heard the door creaking open and closed, footsteps, and the sound of the stall door locking right next to me. My heart raced as I realized I had been completely alone the entire time. I bolted out of there, running down the hall and straight into my boyfriend's arms. Months later, I found out that the women's restroom was one of the most haunted spots in the building. I'm glad I didn't know that before I went in, or I might not have been able to use the restroom at all. The next strange experience happened in a house I bought with that same boyfriend. It was a small house built in the 1940s. There was nothing outwardly creepy about the house, but it didn't take long for weird things to start happening. One day, I was home alone when I heard a man clear his throat right behind me. Some items I'd put on the floor and leaned up against the wall got knocked over, little things like that. But the weirdest thing that happened to me in that house were the knocks. They always seemed to happen when I was home alone. In whatever room I was, there were two loud knocks on the window. It sounded exactly like someone outside came up to the window and knocked on it. Always two good loud raps. The first time I was lying in bed one morning and I heard two knocks on my bedroom window. A quick knock knock. The thing is, my bedroom was in the very back of the house facing the backyard, and the backyard was not accessible except from inside the house. It was a fully fenced, very long backyard, and anyone who came from the street in front couldn't get to it because it was a very narrow passage that we had blocked to keep anyone out. I had been awake when it happened, so I got out of bed and went to the window to see who it could have possibly been. Of course, there was no one there. There was no one anywhere in the backyard. The next time it happened, I was in the kitchen, home alone again, and there were two raps on the kitchen window. It was daytime again, and our kitchen faced the carport. Of course, there was nobody there. After a few more times, I told my boyfriend and my older son about it. Neither of them believed me. They teased me about it, saying I kept dreaming that people were knocking on the windows. So one day, while I was taking a shower, the knocks happened right on the shower window. It was so close to me and so unexpected, I actually jumped. This time I was not home alone, so I thought maybe my boyfriend or my son was playing a joke on me, so I kind of laughed it off. I knew that it would be hard to get to that window though because it faced the blocked, narrow side of the house, and right outside of it were rose bushes with thorns. Later they both swore they hadn't done it. They were very serious, and I could tell that they were telling the truth. They also said they had not heard the knocks, so they still didn't believe me. Only one time do I remember it happening at night. This time I was in the third bedroom that we used as an office in the back of the house. It also faced the inaccessible backyard, and it was late and dark. My curtains were closed, and I was doing something on the computer. When the two loud knocks hit that window, I was too scared to look out the curtains. This only went on for a few months, but it happened a lot, and every time it occurred in whatever room I happened to be in at the time. I never heard it from another room. No one else heard it either. Until one night. On this night, I had gone to bed and my boyfriend and my son were in the living room watching a movie. The next day, they told me that at about 1 a.m., they heard two quick loud knocks on the living room window. There was no knock on the front door, which was right next to the window. They looked out the window and of course, no one was there. It finally happened to someone else in a room that I did not happen to be in, and after that, they finally believed me. Just to preface, my memory of this event is a bit unclear, whether it's due to time passing or the intensity of what happened. For the sake of privacy, let's say my name is Max. I grew up in a medium-sized city in Wisconsin, and this story takes place during my elementary school years. I believe it was around 3rd grade. The day started like any other. I was attending classes, taking notes, and occasionally participating. A few hours into the school day, I raised my hand to ask if I could use the restroom. My teacher gave me permission but told me not to take too long. I left the classroom and started walking to the boys' room, specifically the one near a set of doors that led to the playground. I knew not many kids used that bathroom unless it was recess time, so I figured it would be empty. I was always a bit shy about using the bathroom with others around, and I'd usually wait for everyone to leave before going. Thankfully, I picked the right time. The bathroom was completely empty, and so were the stalls. I went ahead and took care of my business. As I was finishing up, I heard the door open. I thought to myself, great timing. I quickly cleaned up, flushed, and turned to the sink to wash my hands. As I did, I glanced toward the door to see who had entered. I was immediately confused. There was a boy standing there, not quite a kid but not old enough to be a teacher. He looked like he was in his late teens, maybe early 20s. I remember he had dirty blonde hair and pale blue eyes that looked almost cloudy. He was thin but muscular, like an older teenager. I shyly greeted him. "Hello." He simply said, "Hey kid, how's it going?" In a cheerful tone. I answered, "Good. I'm almost done if you need to go." He shook his head and gave me a once-over. I didn't think much of it and started drying my hands with paper towels. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "Hey, do you like wrestling?" Caught me off guard. What a strange question, I thought. Asterisk, why would he ask me that? And why now? I don't even know this guy. Asterisk. I wasn't sure what to say, so I answered with, "Not really, but I haven't seen much." He responded with, "Oh, okay. Cool. Well, hey, I love wrestling. Watching those guys on stage is so awesome. Hey, can I show you this cool new move I saw them do last night?" At that point, I started feeling anxious and sweaty. I didn't want to stay in the bathroom with him and let him show me his moves. So I told him, I'd have to pass, and I don't want to be late for class. But he just smiled and said, "Oh, don't worry. It won't take long. Here, let me show you." He began walking toward me, and it was only then that I realized how much taller he was. My heart began to race, and before I knew it, he grabbed my throat with both hands. He started smiling this giant ear-to-ear grin. His breath smelled like cigarettes. I tapped his arm and asked for him to please let me go with desperation in my voice. He just smiled bigger and began to chuckle to himself as he began lifting me up against the wall, pinning me to it with one hand, still holding me by the throat with the other. I felt my throat tighten and my windpipe close off. My eyes began to water. I was using my hands to cling to his arm, desperately trying to break free as I struggled. And then, like a jolt of lightning, the idea came to me. With all my strength and might, I kicked him as hard as I could right in the balls. I felt his grip loosen for just a second and then tighten with 2 times more force. It didn't work. He laughed and said, "Good effort," this time sounding a lot meaner. I started getting cold as my sight began to blur and my consciousness was slipping. I blacked out. The world and noise faded away. And after that, I woke up on the bathroom floor. He was gone. So I got up a bit shaky, still trying to figure out where he was. And I left the boys' room and slowly walked down the hall back to class, peering over my shoulder to check if he was behind me. I got to my class and stood in the frame of my classroom door, looking down at my shoes and the white tile only to hear my teacher. "Max, didn't I tell you to hurry?" It's been 30 minutes. What were you doing in there? I was stunned. I was alone in that bathroom, knocked out with a stranger for 30 minutes. I yelled back at my teacher in a raspy, harsh voice. Well, it's not my fault some guy choked me. She gave me a mean but curious look and told me to go to my seat and sit down as if she didn't understand me. So I trudged back to my desk and sat. I never told my school what happened, and I told my mom almost 10 years after. The guy never got punished. I don't even think anyone knew he did something. If you want a lesson from this, school bathrooms sucked. A few years ago, I was living in Tbilisi, the capital of the Republic of Georgia, running a somewhat legally ambiguous consumer credit operation. One weekend, I decided to take a much-needed getaway to a nearby small town. The town I chose is a popular tourist destination due to its picturesque location along a river, nestled in a deep valley and surrounded by ancient churches. With so many guest houses, hotels, and rentals available, I decided not to book in advance and instead explore until I found a place that felt right. I eventually stumbled upon a guest house perched on a hill, surrounded by a 1-acre plot of land. Upon entering the guest house, I was greeted in the traditional Georgian manner by a warm, elderly woman and her son, who appeared to be in his early 30s. He went back to his work, filling a large hole that he claimed was for a septic tank, and it had a lingering foul smell. As is common in Georgia, the hostess offered me tea, homemade wine, bread, and cheese, which were all delicious and much appreciated. Although I'm American, my family is from Eastern Europe, so I speak Russian, which is also widely spoken in Georgia. This allowed us to chat for quite a while. Our conversation started off with the usual pleasantries, but it quickly delved into more personal topics, such as whether I was seeing anyone or who I was dating, a question that often arises when you meet sweet grandmothers eager to introduce their granddaughters. At that time, I was dating a fellow expat from a Western European country. When I told the hostess I was in a relationship, she seemed very pleased and asked to see a photo of my girlfriend. After viewing the photo, she nodded approvingly, commenting on my girlfriend's physique in a way that would probably be considered inappropriate if it weren't coming from a sweet old lady. She then pressed me as to why I hadn't invited her to visit, saying that a good boyfriend would do so. Feeling a bit caught off guard, I lied and said my girlfriend was busy with a work project, even though she wasn't, and that she would be arriving later in the evening. The hostess was thrilled by this news and called her son over, asking me to show him the photo of my girlfriend. It had already been established early on in our conversation that I didn't speak Georgian. The son looked at the photo and nodded affirmatively, speaking briefly in Georgian to the hostess, before turning to me with a big smile and a thumbs up. He said in English, "Very pretty, you lucky brother." Then, switching to Russian, he asked if I had texted her to invite her. I lied again, saying that I had sent her a message and that she would be arriving soon. It was around 4 p.m., and the golden hour light illuminated the surrounding mountains and valley, creating a serene atmosphere. The son then asked if I liked cha-cha, Georgia's potent national liquor made from distilled grapes, with an alcohol content ranging from 30 to 75%. By then, I had become quite accustomed to it, despite my lingering unease about their apparent fixation on my female visitor. I agreed to join them. Cha-cha is not for the faint of heart, but at that point, I had become somewhat of a cha-cha connoisseur. I should have paid more notice to the very intentional placement of the shots that he filled for us, but I pushed those misgivings aside and had the shot after a very traditional toast. Around 20 minutes later, I felt exhausted and ill and excused myself to my room, saying that I needed a quick nap. Walking to my room, I knew something was amiss. As mentioned in the beginning, I was fronting a questionable business, and I did have a weapon in my bag and made a mental note to take it and put it under my pillow. But as one can imagine, it isn't easy to remember things even on short term when you're apparently drugged. Despite failing to collect my weapon, as the afternoon sun was blaring into the room and I wanted darkness, passing out at around 4:30 p.m., I awoke to darkness at 4:45 a.m. with a raging headache. My window shades were partially open despite me closing them before passing out. They were opened with about 2 feet of space visible to the outside. My bags were not in the position I left them, and the television was on and on high volume despite me never using it, and the door was only partially closed. I peered out the window and didn't see anything, so I quickly went to my bag, retrieved my weapon, and went to the bathroom with the intention of calling my coworkers or a driver to pick me up. I had no cell service and no Wi-Fi despite having perfectly fine reception the day prior. I went back to the bed with the weapon under my pillow with zero desire or inclination to fall back asleep. After an hour or so of pretending to be asleep, I saw the sun peer through the window to get a look inside. At this point, I was certain it was not my imagination playing tricks on me and that I was in trouble. I came out around sunrise to find both the hostess and her son sipping tea on the deck, and I told the hostess that my girlfriend was arriving soon on a bus and that I would bring her when it arrived. I grabbed my backpack and left my other bag to give the impression I wasn't fleeing. Got service immediately after leaving the property and called a partner to pick me up. Old school businessman who was floating the money that I had run the lending operation with. I told him the story and he said he would handle it, and he did handle it. I still think about the foul-smelling hole the son was digging. Maybe the last guest. Weeks later, I decided that wasn't the place or business for me and applied to law school on the other side of the world. I'm a United States Postal Service carrier, and something really creepy happened to me a few weeks ago on my route. I've been carrying mail for 4 years now, and I've had the same route for about 2 years. It's a decent area, and I've never really had any problems with it, especially compared to some of the sketchy areas around my city where other carriers have to deliver daily. I feel pretty lucky with my route. I always stop at this one park in the middle of my route to eat lunch every day. Usually, there aren't many people there when I am, but this day, there were 2 little girls playing on the playground. The park is pretty big, with pathways, beautiful flowers, and a few fountains. The 2 girls showed up about 20 minutes after I sat down at the picnic area. They were doing their thing, and I was texting my girlfriend and watching videos on my phone when, out of nowhere, a man came up behind me and said, "You better get out of here or I'll call the police, you damn pervert." I was shocked and speechless. I turned around to look at him, and he was huge, probably about 300 pounds, balding, and wearing old-looking glasses. Before I could even think of what to say, he spoke again. "Get out of here or I'll beat the hell out of you." My face turned red with fear, but I finally replied, "I'm just eating my lunch, man. I'm not sure what the problem is." He huffed and turned around, walking away down the path. I sat there in a daze for a moment, then checked the time on my phone. I had 5 minutes left of lunch. I texted my girlfriend about the guy, and then I looked over at the playground. I saw the 2 girls standing on top of a big wooden slide, and the man was standing below them, talking to them. At first, I thought maybe he was their parent or something, and he got paranoid when he saw me eating lunch. But then, I saw him reach up and try to grab one of the girls' ankles. She let out a brief scream, and that's when I stood up. The man turned around, looking in all directions, probably to see if anyone had witnessed it. It seemed like he didn't realize I was still there. I walked over to them quickly and asked, "Hey, do you guys know this man?" The man turned around, his face full of anger and fear. The girls both said, "No," in unison. Immediately, the man started walking away, and I just stood there, watching him leave. After he walked out of the front gate of the park, I asked the girls if they had a phone and could call someone to come get them. One of them did and called somebody. I'm not sure who. I waited until I saw an older woman walk into the park. She approached us and asked what was happening. I told her everything, but her reaction wasn't what I expected. She seemed annoyed, almost annoyed at the girls, and told them to get down and that they were leaving. After the 3 of them left, I checked my phone again and realized I was 35 minutes behind schedule. So I quickly walked out of the park, went to my truck, and drove off. A few blocks down the street, I saw the man sitting in a small red car, glaring at me as I drove by. I immediately pulled out my phone and called my boss. I told him everything I saw, and he said he would call the police. The rest of my shift, I couldn't stop thinking about that guy, and I felt guilty for leaving. When I got back to the office, my boss told me that he had contacted the police and that they went to the park to check things out. I really hope they did and that they caught that guy. I haven't seen him or the girls there since. The crumbling facade of Ravenswood Asylum loomed before me, its broken windows staring down like hollow eyes. I come here looking for thrills, for that perfect creepy photo to boost my urban exploration blog. Instead, I found myself trapped in a waking nightmare, hunted through decaying corridors by those who should have been long gone. Sometimes, the dead don't rest easy, and the insane never truly leave. My name's Maya, and I've always been drawn to abandoned places. There's something hauntingly beautiful about a building left to decay, nature slowly reclaiming what man has discarded. I run a fairly popular blog documenting my urban exploration adventures, and when I heard about Ravenswood, I knew it would be my masterpiece. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, shut down after a series of scandals involving patient abuse and unethical experiments. Local legends spoke of hauntings, of screams echoing through the empty halls at night. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I believed in the power of a good story. I arrived just before sunset, my camera bag heavy on my shoulder. The fence surrounding the property was rusted and bent, easy enough to slip through. As I approached the main building, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. The front door hung off its hinges, creaking ominously in the breeze. I flicked on my flashlight and stepped inside. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing peeling wallpaper and debris-strewn floors. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of decay. I moved deeper into the building, my camera clicking away. Every shadow, every broken piece of furniture told a story. I imagined the lives that had been lived and lost within these walls. It was as I was setting up a shot in what must have been a patient's room that I first heard it. A shuffling sound coming from the corridor outside. I froze, listening intently. Could have been the building settling, I told myself, or maybe an animal that had found its way inside. But then I heard something else. A voice, faint and distant, calling out. "Hello, is someone there? Please, I need help." My heart started racing. Had another urban explorer gotten hurt, or was this some kind of trap? Against my better judgment, I moved toward the sound. "Hello," I called out. "Where are you?" The voice came again, closer this time. "Here. I'm here. Please, help me." I rounded a corner, and my flashlight beam fell on a figure huddled against the wall. It was a young woman, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned hospital gown. She squinted in the sudden light, raising a hand to shield her eyes. "Oh, thank God," she said. "I thought no one would ever come." Something felt off. Her clothes, her manner of speaking, it was all wrong. But she looked so scared, so vulnerable. "Are you hurt?" I asked, taking a step closer. "How did you get here?" She stood up slowly, keeping her eyes down. "They brought me here," she said softly. "The doctors, they said they were going to make me better." A chill ran through me as the implications of her words sank in. This wasn't possible. The asylum had been closed for years, unless I raised my camera, snapping a quick picture. The flash illuminated the corridor for a split second, and what I saw in that moment of clarity made my blood run cold. The woman was transparent. I could see the wall behind her through her body. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. "What are you?" I gasped. Her head snapped up, and I saw her eyes were completely black. A terrible smile spread across her face, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "We're the ones they left behind," she said, her voice suddenly deep and inhuman. "And now you're going to join us." I ran. I didn't plan, just turned and fled back the way I'd come. Behind me, I could hear her laughing, the sound echoing off the walls. As I raced through the corridors, more voices joined hers. Whispers and screams seemed to come from everywhere at once. Shadows moved at the edge of my vision, figures darting just out of sight. I burst into what must have been the main hall, a vast space with a grand staircase leading to upper floors. And there, Blocking my path to the exit stood a group of people. Some wore patient gowns. Others, the uniforms of orderlies and nurses. All of them had the same black eyes, the same terrible smiles. "Welcome home," one of them said, a tall man in a doctor's coat. "We've been waiting for you." I backed away, my eyes darting around for another escape route. "This isn't real," I said, more to myself than to them. "You're not real." The doctor laughed. A chilling sound. "Oh, we're very real, my dear, more real than you can imagine. We've been trapped here for so long, waiting for someone like you, someone to set us free." They began to advance, their movements jerky and unnatural. I turned and ran for the stairs, taking them two at a time. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps thundering on the old wood. The upper floors were a maze of corridors and rooms. I ran blindly, no longer sure which way was out. Every turn brought me face to face with more of them. Patients with vacant eyes, nurses with bloody uniforms, doctors wielding rusted scalpels. I found myself in what must have been a treatment room. Old electroshock machines stood silent witness to past horrors. The only way out was a small window, barely big enough for a person to fit through. As I struggled to open the rusted latch, the door burst open behind me. The spirits poured in, their cold hands reaching for me. With a final desperate shove, the window gave way. I didn't hesitate. I dove through the opening, feeling the old glass scrape against my skin. For a heart-stopping moment, I was falling. Then I hit the overgrown shrubbery below, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Ignoring the pain, I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the fence, practically diving through the gap I'd used to enter. Only when I was back in my car, doors locked and engine running, did I allow myself to breathe. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. As I sped away, I glanced in the rear-view mirror. Ravenswood Asylum stood silhouetted against the night sky. And there, in one of the upper windows, I saw a figure watching me leave. Even from this distance, I could see its eyes gleaming in the darkness. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the city, surrounded by the comforting sounds of traffic and normal living people. It wasn't until I got home that I remembered my camera. With trembling hands, I downloaded the photos. Most were what I expected, creepy shots of abandoned rooms and corridors. But then I came to the one I'd taken of the ghost woman. My breath caught in my throat. There she was, as solid as you or me. But her eyes were completely black, just as I'd seen them. And behind her, reflected in a broken mirror, were faces. Dozens of faces, all with the same black eyes and terrible smiles. I deleted the photos, all of them. Then I threw my camera away for good measure. My urban exploration days were over. I still have nightmares about Ravenswood, about black eyes and reaching hands and the feeling of being trapped in endless decaying corridors. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think I can hear whispers, can see shadows moving just at the edge of my vision. I never wrote about Ravenswood on my blog, never told anyone what really happened that night. Who would believe me? But I know the truth. I know that sometimes the dead don't rest easy, that there are places in this world where the veil between life and death is thin, where the insane and the tortured linger long after their bodies have turned to dust. And I know that Ravenswood is waiting for the next curious explorer, the next thrill seeker looking for a good scare, waiting to welcome them home just as it had welcomed me. So if you're ever driving down a lonely road and see a crumbling old building in the distance, think twice before exploring, because you never know what might be exploring you right back. And once you enter places like Ravenswood, you might find that you never truly leave.